Okay, perfect. Welcome, everyone. I'm Isabelle Méjean from Sciences Po. And I'm very glad to welcome you here today for the 4th edition of the Kiel-CEPR Conference on Geoeconomics. So we have a very packed two-day schedule, so I'm not going to take long. I'm just going to leave the mic to Christoph, who's going to give a few words on the overall organization, and then we'll have the opening.
Welcome, everybody. Warm welcome by the side of the Kiel Institute. It's great to see this conference grow, this conference strive, and the field strive. We started this a couple of years ago. It wasn't clear just how big this would become and how much quality work on this topic would emerge. It's good to see economists having much more to say on these fundamental shifts in the economic and political order that we are observing. Thanks, everybody, for coming, especially those who flew in from far away to join us. Much appreciated. My job is to first say thank you to a lot of people. So first of all, thank you to the hosts of today for making this possible, for welcoming us at Sciences Po in beautiful Paris. We will have a few opening remarks by Director Vassy of Sciences Po. And I'd like to say thanks to CPR for making this possible, to the Recipe Network, to Bocconi, who's a strategic partner in this conference, and of course to the German ambassador who was kind enough to invite us to his residency this afternoon, Stefan Steinlein, and most of all, of course, to the organizing team who made all of this possible. I have only very little time, so I can't name everybody who has made this possible, but thank you so much. It's perfect. If you have any question, there's 2 PDFs that contain any information you possibly think of. There's perfectly aligned Google Maps, everything. It's just a piece of art. So thanks a lot for making that possible. Okay. In terms of housekeeping, today we'll have 2 sessions and Ken Rogoff's keynote in this building. There's a second room up in 405 on the 4th floor, so there's a bit of stair walking involved. There's time between the sessions, but keep in mind that it might take a little longer. After the second session wraps up, take all your belongings, because then we'll be over within this building, and we will move to lunch. For lunch, you have to walk out, left and left again, but there will be people in red pullovers who will guide you and help you, so that economists often get lost, so they will make sure that doesn't happen to too many people. Then we will move to those who have registered to the residence of the German ambassador, where we have the Bernhard Harms Prize and the panel on defense, and followed by a reception, and then for those who registered, the dinner. The sessions will be chaired. There's a bit of a tradition here at this conference that the session always chaired by juniors, right? So from the Kiel Institute, the postdocs and doctoral students. They will try to be very German. Not all of them are German. In fact, the minority is, but they will try to be German and enforcing time. So please respect that. These sessions will be filmed and posted on YouTube. It's not live streamed, but posted on YouTube. You can opt out. If you don't want to be posted on YouTube, then just let us know. And then my last point is that I have to apologize to all parents, especially those who flew in and can't be back by Friday night because it's Halloween. So when we scheduled the conference, we didn't realize that Halloween evening is Friday evening. Okay, thank you so much and welcome everybody. And now.
Okay, so the opening is going to be given by Vassy. Louis is the president of Sciences Po, has been for something like a year. And before was at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so has some kind of genuine interest in the topic, I guess.
Thank you so much. I won't be too long, and I simply want to thank also our partners also for choosing Sciences Po for this 4th edition of this conference, especially our partners from the Kiel Institutes, obviously, the Center for Economic Policy and Research, and of course, I want to thank our own economics department here at Sciences Po for working on this beautiful event, which I see indeed attracts lots of people, and I'm glad it's the case. Indeed, I'll say a few words about the importance of this topic for us here at Sciences Po, and indeed for me personally. Thank you also to the German embassy and to my friend Stefan Steinlein, who I think is going to host you later today for the keynote of Professor Rogoff. I guess I would like to start indeed by saying how gratifying it is to see that a strong French-German cooperation also happens on these academic cooperation issues and these topics. Europe is already at the heart of what we do here at Sciences Po, but it's no secret for people that have been following our first months here. Indeed, it's been a little bit more than a year that we'll be investing a lot more even on European affairs. And I think there is indeed a link with what you are going to discuss today. Why? Because of course, geoeconomics is getting more and more importance in the overall global debate. But if there is one continent whose worldviews are most shattered by the evolution of the international context, it's certainly Europe. We've built the whole European Union, of course, an adventure on the premise that law regulations would prevail over blatant balance of power. We've worked on the premise for decades that we were powerful because of the size of our market, and we now discover that maybe power is related to what you produce rather than what you buy. And these are these are ideas that can be conveyed in few words, but in fact are in fact a complete revolution in the way we need to see ourselves. I guess I'd like to underline how much I believe that Sciences Po is one of the few places around where we can have this discussion in the most valid way, because interdisciplinarity, of course, has been at the heart of what we do here for 150 years, and of course, connecting international relations, economics, is maybe more natural here than in other places. In essence, what we need to do is connect different disciplinary fields, understand that your reasonings understand that economics, of course, is one of the foundations of power. I think there is lots of literature to that effect, that even if you want to forget that, others won't forget you. I was watching the other day with my two sons the beginning of Lords of the Rings, and the hobbits at some point say there is a discussion between the hobbits that really had me thinking about these issues on geoeconomics. The hobbits discuss, and one of them says, let's forget about the outside world, about Sauron and Mordor, and we live on our small shire and forget about the world. The problem, of course, is that the others won't forget you, and they will, if you're too weak, if your economy is too small, at some point power dynamics will come to you. And that's what I call the 1854 effect, when, as you know, Commodore Perry arrived in the Bay of Tokyo and imposed a new worldview to Imperial Japan. And so, indeed, the connection between the way your economy works, the size of your production, but also the way you integrate into international trade, your control of interfaces, your control of some nodal goods, as we see these days with rare earths, of course, has a great effect on the way you will be able to project or not your power, or be submitted to the projection of power of others. So right now we see trade restrictions, sanctions, industrial policies being used to indeed develop one's own power. We see supply chain realignments. We see the use of raw material as a tool for pressure in international discussions. And we see all that in a context also where the traditional alignments, let's say, including the transatlantic one, are being revisited, which means that there is, again, a kind of urgency for Europeans, I guess, to revisit the way they work on these issues. So, indeed, you're right, this is going to be domain in which we'll be continuing investing through the economics department, but also beyond. I just want to mention that it's your presence here is extremely timely. We just launched 4 or 5 weeks ago a kind of study committee on the way we articulate and work on international relations here at Sciences Po. It's not by chance that it's co-chaired by a former French defense minister. It means that indeed we are going to look even more. We already do a lot, but even more in strategic issues, defense issues, defense industrial base. And all these issues, of course, have deep and strong links to geoeconomics. And so that will also be a field, I hope, where we'll be growing here at Sciences Po. With that, I want to thank you for being here and just convey once again how important what you'll be discussing here today is to us here at Sciences Po, and hope the best for the day. Thank you.
Very much. Apologies. I am Daniel Gross from the Institute for Economic Policy Making at Bocconi, and we are co-sponsoring this session in particular, and have been working with Kiel also on other occasions. We had last year also a very interesting junior workshop to give some of the participants that maybe don't make it today to present their work at a preliminary stage. My task today is just to be the German housekeeper, and so the rules are that you have 20 minutes for your presentation. We have then 10 minutes for the discussant and 10 minutes for the open discussion. And without further ado, I therefore think we can start a few minutes early. 4 minutes late. I thought we were early. I thought it was 9:30. Apologies. So this session is about the world trading system. And the first paper is International Trade in an Uncertain World by Kleinman from Stanford, who will present.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for the organizers for inviting our paper. So this is International Trade in an Uncertain World, and it's joined with Ernest Leo and Steve Redding. So the motivation for the paper is quite clear. There are growing concerns in the world about uncertainty and resilience in international trade. Examples include transportation disruptions, such as those that emerged during and after COVID, uncertainty about trade policy, and rising geopolitical tensions. And some key questions that come up in the context of uncertainty and trade include: how does uncertainty shapes traditional questions that we ask in trade theory, such as the patterns of trade and the gains from trade? What is the role of uncertainty in shaping trade frictions between countries and linkages between countries? And to what extent can countries actually use trade in order to hedge against rising uncertainty? So in this paper, we aim to tackle these questions through a framework that combines uncertainty in trade models. So in particular, we make 3 contributions. First, we just integrate uncertainty into standard general equilibrium quantitative trade models and develop tools to characterize the equilibrium in these models. So in a nutshell, we analytically characterize the first and second moments of the central equilibrium objects, such as equilibrium wages, trade flows, and welfare. That's building very much on developments in the international macro and international finance literature. Second, we allow countries to make upfront investments in import and export capacities. So the idea being that countries don't only choose trade decisions on production and consumption after uncertainty is realized, but some of your decision on trade flows are chosen before uncertainty is materialized in anticipation of uncertainty. So when we model it through this type of investment in capacities that effectively endogenize bilateral trade frictions between countries. And then we use this framework that has the uncertainty and the ex-ante investments in order to study what is the role of global and local uncertainty in shaping the patterns of trade and gains from trade. So this means how do changes in the variance, either global of shocks, either globally or locally, would affect trade. And secondly, how do countries' risk profile, so that would be a change in the covariance structure of shocks across countries, affects also trade. Okay, so let me, in the interest of time, skip the literature today, but in a nutshell, we try to introduce uncertainty into quantitative trade models and building very much on rich literature in international macro and finance. Okay, so let me jump into the theoretical framework, and before introducing our new elements, let me start with the benchmark Armington trade model, just to fix notation and ideas. So the standard Armington model, you have in each country a representative agent with label endowment L bar. Countries consume goods from all other countries with the constant elasticity of substitution preference and elasticity of substitution omega across the varieties of all countries. Production is constant returns to scale, with label being the only factor of production and denoting Z as the label productivity in each country. And you have standard iceberg trade costs between countries, so that in order to ship 1 unit of good from country A to country N, you need to produce tau units of the good. Label market clearing requires that your label endowment matches the sum of production labor across all the countries that you sell goods to. And then the equilibrium is characterized by this standard fixed point for wages in all countries, in which the total income in country I equals to the total expenditure on the goods of country I across all country N. So you have the fixed point for wages in terms of the exogenous parameters in the model. So that's a standard Armington model. Now let's go to our extensions. So the first extension that we do is just to introduce uncertainty. So in Armington, productivities and trade shocks are deterministic. Now they'll be random. And in order for that to be meaningful, we assume now that agents are risk averse. So agents have a constant relative risk aversion, parameters over the consumption bundle with risk aversion coefficient gamma. Cn is still the standard Armington aggregator, so that's the first deviation. Second deviation, as I mentioned before, we want to allow countries to decide some of their trade patterns before uncertainty is realized. So we do that through introducing import and export capacities that are chosen ex ante. So you choose production label exposed just as before in standard Armington once you see the realization of productivities, but you choose IOTAs, which are the investment in importing capacity, and H, which is investment in exporter capacity, before you know what is the realization of the different shocks. And this gives rise to effectively a Cobb-Douglas production function for the goods that you sell from country I to country N that has a coefficient of alpha on the import capacities that is chosen by the importer, on the export capacities that are chosen by the exporter, so coefficient beta on the export capacities, which are chosen by the exporter, and the coefficient delta on the standard Armington unit cost that is chosen exposed after uncertainty is realized. The adjusted market clearing now requires that your total label endowment equals to total exposed production labor and to the total investment that you put into import capacities and into export capacities. Note that without uncertainty, if you solve for these ex-ante investments, it boils down to something that is isomorphic to a standard Armington model, so it's not very interesting. But once you allow for uncertainty, these decisions are shaped by uncertainty, and then it becomes a more interesting extension. Okay, so let me start now characterizing the equilibrium, and we'll first discuss the exposed stage, so after uncertainty is realized, and then talk about the ex-ante stage. So exposed, you know already the realization of productivities and of trade costs, and you also take the ex-ante investments iota and H as given. So what you get is the same fixed point for wages as we saw earlier in the standard Armington model, with two differences. The first difference is just that the production labor is what left after you did all the ex-ante export and import investments. And the second difference is that trade frictions are now shifted by the investments that you did at ex-ante. So you have different trade frictions on top of the exogenous part tau. Oh, and in addition, you have a slightly different trade elasticity that takes into account both the differentiation in preferences and the curvature on the exposed inputs into production. Okay, so that's the exposed stage. So for any realization of productivity and trade cost, you can solve for the wages in equilibrium. In the ex ante stage, you choose the ex ante investments, and then they depend on the expectations that you form over the distribution of prices in equilibrium. So that depends on the joint distribution of the wages across the different countries, as well as the joint distributions of the wages with other equilibrium objects. And when you make these ex ante decisions, you essentially trade off two key forces. The first force is that you want to invest more in the countries that provide relatively cheap goods for you. So that would be your home market or countries that are close to you, for example. That's the standard forces from the Armington model. The second force, due to risk, is that you want to hedge, right? You want to potentially invest more in countries that would provide you some kind of hedging against the exposed risk. For example, countries that have relatively low covariance with your own productivity. So through this, two forces, you choose your investments in import and export capacities. In practice, it takes the following form. First of all, your total investment in the import capacity is just a constant share of your endowment due to the Kopdakl structure. Likewise, the total investment in export capacity is also a constant share of total endowment. And the allocation of trade capacity across all your different trade partners is proportional to your expected expenditure on this trade partner, adjusted by your marginal utility of income. Similarly, for exporter capacity, it's proportional to your income from your trade partner, adjusted for the marginal utility of income. To give a better sense of what exactly goes into these decisions, so we take a second order approximation of these decisions. And then we can highlight the key forces that go into the investment capacity, the import and export capacities. So in a nutshell, an importer N would invest more into import capacity of goods from country I if they're cheap on average, so that would be just the first line over there. When their marginal when the I's goods are cheap, when N's marginal utility is relatively high, that's the second line. Similarly, when I's goods are cheap, when N's purchasing power in terms of real wages is relatively high, that's the third line. And when the other goods in N's consumption bundle are relatively expensive. You get isomorph or similar intuition for the export capacity. Again, exporter I would like to invest more if the importer has relatively high expenditure on I on average, when I's marginal utility is high, and when I's CPI is low, or when the cost of production of the producing country is low. Okay, so this is how the export and import capacities are characterized. In practice, in order to solve them, you need to know all these covariance terms, right? You need to know the joint distribution of prices in equilibrium and of all the different equilibrium objects. So in order to make progress there, we derive analytical formulas for all these joint distributions under a second order approximation assumption. So let me demonstrate that in a relatively simple setting in which trade costs are fixed and known, but we allow productivities to be random. So suppose you know that the first order of productivities is mu, first moment of productivities is mu, and the variance-covariance matrix of productivities is given by sigma z. And let me also denote the equilibrium function that maps a realization of productivities to a realization of wages by f. So that takes countries' productivities and parameters and spits out a vector of wages. So then, to a second order, you can derive the first and second moment of the wages using these two formulas, which depend on the exogenous determinants of the productivity process, and on two matrices, the Jacobian matrix of the equilibrium function, that's W, and the Hessian matrix of the equilibrium function, that's H. Moreover, both W and H are simply functions of these exogenous parameters of the model and of the expenditure share matrix S, from the deterministic Carmington model. So if you know the expenditure share metrics and the exogenous determinants of productivity, you can characterize the distribution of the joint distribution of wages in equilibrium up to a second order. So let me kind of combine it all together. How does the solution of the equilibrium look like? So suppose that you know the trade costs and you know the mean of productivities and the Barnes-Covariance metrics of productivities. Then first you initialize a gas of ex-ante bilateral investments across all trade partners. Conditional on this gas, you can solve for the bilateral expenditure shares. That's the S metrics by just solving a deterministic Carmington model. The next step is, once you have the deterministic Carmington model, you derive the Jacobian and the Hessian matrices of the equilibrium function using the formulas that I just showed you now. And once you have this joint distribution of all equilibrium objects up to second order, you can update the ex-ante investments iota and H using the formulas for the investments that I showed you before, and you iterate until convergence. And this is how you solve for equilibrium. Okay, so now let me use this framework to demonstrate it for a few counterfactuals that we consider. Briefly on the data, we use standard sources on data on international trade, including trade flows from the IMF and the World Input-Output database. In terms of parameterization, we set the coefficient on import capacity and on export capacity to be the same. And then we set their level as well as the differentiation of goods across countries to match existing estimates on short-run and long-run elasticities. We set a risk aversion of gamma equal 10 in line with the estimates in the finance literature. And then and you can read more about that in the paper, to get the trade costs and the mean of the productivities and the Barnes-Covariance metrics of productivities, we invert the equilibrium conditions of the model. Okay, so let me, before going to the counterfactual, just flesh out a bit how does the Barnes-Covariance metrics looks in practice. So here are two examples. Here are two examples for entries in our empirical Barnes-Covariance metrics of productivities. On the left hand, you have the productivity path, the trended productivity path for Germany and France. They're highly correlated, so that would be a very high value in the Barnes metrics. And on the right hand, the right panel has Kuwait and Korea, and there you see a very negative covariance between them. That would be a very strong and negative entry into our variance metrics. Another strong feature of the Barnes metrics that will be important for the counterfactual is that it features a strong global factor. So this is the first principal component of the productivity in the data, and the variance and it can account for 43% of the variance of the productivity variance in our data. And the loadings of different countries on this global component will play a key feature in our counterfactuals. Perfect. Okay, so in the first counterfactual, we want to study what is the role of the covariance structure in risk for trade patterns. So what we do is simply to eliminate the correlations in the productivity, so set all the covariance terms to 0 in our covariance metrics, holding the variance constant, so the diagonal remains the same, and holding constant the means. So here I plot changes in country level outcomes against the loading on the global productivity factor. So we see here what happens to the welfare of these countries, what happens to their own trade shares, or in other words, to trade openness, and what happens to their investment in their home market. So how much do they invest in other countries relative to how much they invest in themselves? And we can say that countries such as Ireland that load strongly on the global factor, they see an increase in their welfare gains and a decline in their own trade share. So they become more open and they diversify their trade more. And the logic is very simple. Because they load strongly on the global factor, once you kill the correlation structure, you really increase the ability of these countries to hedge through trade. So then their welfare goes up and their openness goes up. Whereas countries that load negatively on the global factor, the opposite is going on. The welfare is going down and their openness is going down. The second counterfactual is to just ask what would happen if we double global uncertainty. So if risk in the world is going up, So the way that we do it is that we double the size of the scale of the variance-covariance matrix, holding constant expected productivities and the correlation structure across countries. Welfare is going down across all countries, and particularly so for very risky countries, basically because of risk aversion, right? Countries that don't like risk. More interestingly, we find that countries' own trade share and own investment share is going down, especially for the risky countries. And countries become basically more open. And that again goes through this hedging logic. Countries basically trade off two things, as I mentioned before. You want cheap goods on the one hand, but you also want to hedge on the other hand. And when the global variance goes up, the importance of the hedging motive increases relative to the importance of sourcing cheap goods. So countries diversify more through trade. The final expansion counterfactual that we consider is to consider a rise in local uncertainty in some country as opposed to just global uncertainty going up. So we consider what is just the variance in the US productivity is going up, holding constant the mean of the US and the correlation structure of the US, and almost done. So here we plot a bunch of country-level results of the US trade partners against their basic covariance with the US. And what we see is that what matters a lot for the results in terms of how are you affected by it is whether your covariance with the US is positive or negative, and in particular for countries such as Canada or Ireland that are very positively, their covariance with the US is very positive, they see a reduction in their welfare, an increase in their investment in the US, an increase in their investment in home country, so they do effectively reshoring, right? They decrease exposure to the US and increase exposure to their home country. What happens to the countries that cover negatively is exactly the opposite. Okay, so let me conclude. We extend basic standard quantitative trade models to include general equilibrium uncertainty and endogenous trade frictions through this upfront investment in import and export capacities. We characterize the equilibrium by providing analytical solution for the first and second moments for the different equilibrium objects, which allow us a relatively tractable approach to solve for equilibrium. And then we use our framework to study how changes in global and local uncertainty or the importance of or in countries' risk profiles shape the patterns of trade and against trade. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. You were perfectly in time. I rushed you a bit on purpose. The discussant is Isabelle Méjean.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Very nice presentation. So, as you understood, this paper is the main contribution is to kind of embed uncertainty into the standard framework that we use in international trade to study gains from trade, so the ACR framework. And in doing this, the paper is going to kind of build a bridge between the trade and international macro literatures. So in trade, we're mostly interested in understanding how access to foreign markets is going to induce some welfare gains by increasing the average real consumption in economies that are opening up to international trade. In macro, they think a lot about how access to foreign markets is also going to bring some form of risk sharing, so reducing the variance of consumption and helping consumers smooth out their consumption over time. And as you can see very nicely from this formula that I took from the paper, this framework that they are developing is going to have together both the kind of efficiency gains from opening up to trade, so the impact on the first moment of consumption, plus some risk-sharing properties, so an impact of opening up on the variance of your consumption. So this is a very nice, I think, paper, a very ambitious research agenda that the authors have. And the kind of common element of this research agenda is how they are managed to bring very elegant analytical framework to tackle very important questions. So in my discussion, I'm going to come back on some of the empirical implications that they have that I think are a bit underdeveloped as of now in the draft. And a small disclaimer, I was very late on doing my discussion, so was kind of happy that all the references to the appendix in the paper point to an appendix that is not in the paper. So I've decided to just trust the author on everything and only comment on what I understood from their results. Okay, so maybe let me just take a step back and emphasize a few assumptions that are very important in what they do. Might not seem that surprising for trade people, maybe a bit more for people that are not into the trade literature. So this is a paper on risk sharing, but that doesn't have any trade in financial assets, so there is no financial risk sharing in this model. And in case you want to smooth out consumption, the only option that you have is to use international trade to achieve this risk sharing. The second important assumption is that this is a model of investment, but that is kept in a static framework. So this is not really investment in the kind of macro dynamic way. So the way it works is that the assumption is that there is some predetermined investment in trade capacities that is made before uncertainty is realized, and then ex post, labor is perfectly flexible, and so is going to adjust so that to clear the labor markets. And these are these two assumptions that bring this very nice feature of the model that implies that ex ante investment into trade capacities are going to potentially focus or target some hedging purposes. The third assumption is that this is a paper in which uncertainty has some real impact, but not in the kind of Dixit-Pindic type of way. So the reason why uncertainty has an impact here is because households are risk averse, and because of this risk aversion, they are willing to smooth consumption, and this generates this link between uncertainty and the level of investment. And finally, the very important assumption, I think, is that the production function is Cobb-Douglas. You all know how useful Cobb-Douglas is in a lot of setups. So here, the production function is Cobb-Douglas between labor and investment in trade capacities, and in investment in trade capacities from both importers and exporters. So that means that in this framework, countries are going to decide independently from each other on how much they invest into importing capacities and exporting capacities. And there is this assumption of a unitary elasticity of substitution between both types of investment. So given these assumptions, the rest has been already well described by Benny, so I'm going to skip maybe most of it. But basically, the way the model is solved is by first solving for relative wages using the ex post equilibrium, and in particular the labor market clearing conditions. So this is a formula that all trade people, I think, are very familiar with. It very much looks like the ACR type of labor market conditions with a few twists. The first one is that this is done ex post, so once investment has already been decided, so the labor endowments that are ensuring this labor market equilibrium conditions, whatever is left for production once investment has been done. The second twist compared to ACR is that the bilateral trade cost now is going to be the product of something that is exogenous and the part that is endogenous to investment decisions. And the third implication is that the trade elasticity is systematically lower in the short run than what we would have in a standard ACR framework. So I don't know if the reference is useful, but this really made me think of this old Corsetti and Dedola paper in which they introduce a non-tradable service component into the bilateral trade cost. And as a consequence of this non-tradable service for trade cost, they show that the trade elasticity is reduced, and this has consequences for risk sharing and pass-through. So there is clearly a connection here. I don't know how useful this is, but I think it could be a reference to check. The second part is solving for ex-ante investment. And here, as was explained before, what is very nice is that because you have Cobb-Douglas, the global level of investment is kind of exogenously given. This is the first line. And then the only thing you need to care about is how to allocate this investment between bilateral pairs. And here, because of the risk aversion of the consumer, you want to invest into trade relationships that are not only high return in expectation, but also bring some risk-sharing properties. And this is really where you have the combination of efficiency and risk-sharing showing up in the model. So I think proposition 3 is really a very nice one that contains a lot of insight. But the way I'm summarizing it is just that as an importer, you want to import into importing capacities towards countries that bring low prices, but also low prices, especially when you're willing to consume more. So this is the risk-sharing part. And likewise on the export side. Okay, so now, as I said, I think that there are a number of empirical implications of this type of framework that are maybe worth digging into a bit more. Of course, the model is quite rich, but if you want to summarize it very quickly, what you get is that compared to the no uncertainty baseline, these type of risk-sharing motives for investing into trade capacities are going to distort the geography of trade in a way that is a bit complicated. So the first consequence of this is that in this model, independence of irrelevant alternatives no longer hold, which I think is kind of an important prediction because typically in trade, we rely a lot on this assumption for both empirical purposes. I see Thierry nodding here. I mean, this is very important in the structural gravity literature. It's also an assumption that I thought was very important to maintain the kind of family of models that ACR are contemplating. So in particular, this assumption is part of their macro-level restriction 3 for people that are very familiar with this paper. But basically, they argue that this is a very important one. So I think it would be interesting to discuss a bit more how you kind of maintain the type of ACR type of results despite the fact that this assumption no longer holds. The other implication that is maybe a bit easier to discuss is that the impact on the geography of trade that is induced by these new risk-sharing motives is going to depend systematically on the whole matrix of variance covariance. So the model lets this matrix kind of unconstrained, but in the data we know that this matrix follows some very strong empirical regularities that are to some extent related to the kind of common factor that you mentioned before. So what we know in the data is that countries that trade more together are have way more correlated business cycles. And there is a lot of literature that is trying to think about this trade co-movement correlation. So here I'm only citing a few papers from people that I know are in the room, but there is a lot of literature on this topic. So what does this correlation mean? It means that if you think in terms of hedging motives, the fact that countries that are close by co-move more together implies that in principle you would like to diversify away from those countries in order to gain on the risk sharing. And so if this is true, and if part of this correlation is driven by, say, countries that are close by being exposed to the same type of shocks, then this means that in standard gravity equation, in which these hedging motives are neglected, there is a systematic omitted variable bias due to the fact that actually your, the geography of your trade is not only shaped by the first moment, so the level of bilateral trade costs, but also the risk-sharing properties of those. So this is just like illustrating this, but I think the intuition is very clear. If on average countries that are close by tend to co-move more, then through risk-sharing, I'm going to try to diversify away from those, and that means that the forces towards gravity are going to be less strong. So let me finish with a few more things that I think would be interesting to discuss either in this or in the next papers in this research agenda. The first one is again like tied with what we know from the empirical trade patterns. So empirically we know that trade portfolios are extremely poorly diversified. And this is true on the import or export side, whether at the level of firms or countries. And this is related to the fact that there are a lot of zeros in trade matrices. So actually when you look at the raw data, most countries only trade with a very small number of partners. So obviously your setup is not well suited to think about those zeros because there are no zero in the type of models that you're using that also Arkolakis et al. Are using. But that means that in these models, there will always be more diversification that there can actually be in the data, because the data have a lot of zeros and there's very few opportunities for diversifying. So I don't know how to think about this. Of course, it requires some more ingredients that are going to kind of affect the tractability of the model, but I think it would be interesting to think about this. The other two elements are maybe a bit more like for future works, but in the literature, there are discussions about how opening up to trade modifies endogenously the variance-covariance matrix that I mentioned before. So Di Giovanni-Levchenko is one such example. There are many more. And finally, I mean, obviously, and I'm sure Ernest, and I mean, you've thought about this, but this is a structure in which there's no input-output linkages, so trade is only on final goods. Plugging in input-output linkages would be interesting, because that means that endogenously there will be some co-movements that are due to these input-output linkages. But then there is a bit of a trade-off between efficiency and risk sharing. You want to benefit from global value chains because it reduces your cost. But in the meantime, it also makes your output more correlated with your partners, which might not be good in terms of risk sharing. So let me stop here. I'm already out of time. Thanks very much. Very interesting work.
Thank you. Kenny, why don't you come here? Why don't you come here and perhaps I will already see hands up, so maybe in the interest of time, I will already ask you if you could just identify yourself.
Yes. Hi, I'm Nitya. I have two questions. So first, you assume that agents understand the distribution of risk and how realistic and how important is that for your solution method? Because it's likely that agents don't actually know what the risk is. I mean, it's possible. Second is international macro kind of, including the papers that Isabelle mentioned, largely discarded TFP shocks as an explanation for co-movement of a business cycles, because in any measurement of TFP shocks, whether you do slow residuals, you do utilization adjusted, we find that they are uncorrelated across countries. Instead, what you usually find, if there are correlated shocks, they tend to be demand driven. So I'm trying to understand how you back out your productivity, and is it really just picking up demand driven shocks?
Okay, that was a good couple of questions. I propose first, Penny, that you get a couple of minutes just to reply to your discussion and this question, and then we take further questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Isabelle. That was great. So I agree with a lot of the comments. Let me just reply on a few. So yeah, to understand the welfare implications of, say, rising uncertainty, of course, it's key to take an assumption on what are the options for agents to diversify, right? Not only through trade. And that's something that the way that we think to address this is to basically to give you the extreme cases, one with completely incomplete markets like we do here, and then we also work on the version with completely complete markets. You know, people have very different views on the degree of market incompleteness, and then hopefully you can choose like which benchmark you think is better. But indeed, it will matter. Let me say that the results that I showed you, the analytical results, hold in either case, right? But quantitatively, you know, the covariance, say the covariance with your local marginal utility of income will be shaped by your other opportunities to hedge. So that would be important. Then your point about the changes in the geography in a world with risk, I think it's fascinating, and we actually thought maybe, you know, see how does rising in different types of uncertainty actually shapes the gravity coefficient that we would get in the model by running the gravity equation in the model. So that would be interesting. And then in terms of the endogenizing the variance-covariance metrics, so I completely agree that that's an interesting direction. Let me do mention that in terms of the variance-covariance of the endogenous objects, they're partly endogenous through trade, right? So even without any co-movement in the productivity, you do get co-movement in the model in the endogenous objects because of trade and trade frictions and so on. But adding these extra layers of multiple sectors, input-output linkages, the firm dynamics as you mentioned, so that of course, the more you add in, the less you'll put on the variance-covariance metric. it's a natural direction. On Nitya's points, yes, we assume that agents understand the uncertainty, and that's a very valid point. I think that's another point that my reading of the literature is that people disagree on to what extent do agents perceive correctly. So we take a very much rational expectations direction as a benchmark, and I think that deviating from it is also interesting. On your point about TFP shocks, yeah, so we completely agree. We think that our what we call TFP shocks could also be interpreted as demand shocks, and that would be the covariance of demand shocks across countries. It's you can think about the demand shocks as there's the changes in the discounting factors, so that's one direction. It's less relevant here because it's a static model, and then there's the just changes in your perceived quality of different goods across countries, and definitely that's one interpretation for them. So we're comfortable with this interpretation. Yeah.
Thank you. If you could introduce yourself.
I'm Giorgio, Institute for European Policymaking. Does introducing uncertainty and hedging property of trade increases your predicted welfare gains from trade?
Does it increase your welfare gains from trade? So I think the answer is positive because you get this extra, you have the hedging gains that you get on top of the efficiency gains. I'll need to think if it's universally true, right? That that's on average true. I need to think if that would be true for any given country, whether opening up to trade would necessarily increase your welfare gains relative to the gains that you would get without the hedging. I think it would. It might depend on the full structural variance covariance metrics and the trade costs.
Thanks. Unless there's further questions, I think we can then go to the next paper. But maybe I can ask you one final question, which is that given the motivation of this conference and the world we see outside, I would have expected you to put more emphasis on, let's say, uncertainty about the trade costs rather than productivity abroad. Mm-hmm. Have you done that already? And
so, yeah, that's something that we already did analytically. So we have the formulas for how to solve the model and all this characterization of the ex-ante investments in terms of the uncertainty about trade costs. It's a much higher dimensional object, so we think how to quantitatively address it in an interesting way. It's also harder just to put numbers on it relative to productivity because of the higher dimensionality, but I think it's absolutely, I think it's important, and that's something that we're thinking about.
So would you expect that more uncertainty about trade costs leads to more trade?
There's indeed the hedging motive is another motive to trade. So there's that. As I showed you briefly, it does depend on, for example, in the context of productivity, whether more uncertainty leads you to trade more or less depends on how you load on the global factor, right? So something similar, I think, would be going on in the trade costs that, in principle, that's another reason to trade, but in practice, it would depend on your risk profile, right?
Okay. Thanks a lot. I have already abused my position here as the chair. And we come now to the second paper. Many thanks, Ben. About a world trading system for whom? Evidence from global tariffs. And the presenter is Rodrigo Adão. If you sit down, I think you can use this one. And I've been asked to be, you should speak very closely to the mic because it's being recorded.
So let me try that.
Or there's the mic to walk if you want.
Hello. Is it on?
That I don't know.
Okay, I'll try this one.
Okay.
Hello. Okay, thank you all for coming. Thank you, the organizers, for putting the paper in the program. I'm happy to present this work that is joint with John Becker, who's sitting here, Arno Cosino, Dave Donaldson, our world trading system for home, evidence from global tariffs. All right, so can I just try to do least I can see whatever you're seeing too. All right, so in this paper, we're going to be thinking about international cooperation. And the way we're going to be thinking about it is that it is ultimately about countries internalizing the impact of their policies onto their trade partners. So this type of way of thinking about international cooperation could arise from many type of mechanisms. It could be about formal institutions. For example, the rules of the WTO or GATT actually force countries to internalize the impact of their policies on the terms of trade effects on their trading partners. Or it could be about informal institutions. For example, a country may prevent from manipulating terms of trade because it fears that it's going to suffer retaliation from its trading partners. Despite being so central in theories of international cooperation, there are a few important open questions on the empirical side that we think we can make some progress on, and we're going to be addressing today. So specifically, we're going to be thinking about first measuring how much do countries actually internalize the impact of their policies on their trading partners. And then once we have this measurement, we're going to be thinking about how does international cooperation actually vary across trading partners. So the key idea in this paper that we're going to use to answer these questions is a notion of reviewed preferences that we can actually measure international cooperation from the trade policies that countries effectively choose. So the first part here is going to be a theoretical framework. We are going to actually introduce a way of thinking about international cooperation in tariff setting. It's going to be something that we are going to call as-if altruism. I'm going to be clear about what that means later on. But it's the idea that countries may actually take into account in their tariff setting the impact of that policy on their partners. So we're going to, in that setting, derive a formula for the tariffs that country J will choose optimally. And the key thing is that this formula is going to have this as-if altruism, meaning that the tariff that country J will impose on a product will actually take into account how much country J values income transfers to a partner I relative to its own residence. That's the parameter that I'm going to call beta ij. You're going to see that parameter floating around a lot throughout the talk. It's going to be actually a summary that is going to arise in equilibrium of many theories of international cooperation that is going to be really kind of capturing how much these institutions in the global trading system will force or induce countries to cooperate with the others, value transfers to partners relative to their own residents. And we can use it actually to think about the characteristics that emerge from the global equilibrium in terms of this cooperation, and potentially think about the mechanisms that are going to be shaping this type of cooperation that we observe. So once we establish this formula, in the second part of the paper, we are going to put this formula to work. The idea is to actually apply it to the actual tariffs that we observe countries setting. We are going to first do that for 2001, and we're going to get our first main finding here is that in 2001, what we saw already, and we picked 2001 because that's the year after the Uruguay round has already been implemented in the tariffs of the countries in our sample. We're going to see that this beta is equal on average for the typical relationship in our data of 0.8. And that means that countries typically value transfers to partners at 80% of the value that they would put on a transfer to their own residents. That means that we find that there is quite a bit of cooperation in the world trading system. If they were not cooperating, this number would be 0. So there is quite a bit of cooperation here. But despite this cooperation, we still find that we are far away from an efficient equilibrium, even within the countries that were participating in the WTO. Our second main finding here is that we uncover a general form of reciprocal behavior in trading relationships. We see that countries that tend to value their partners more are reciprocated by their partners actually valuing them more as well. So there is something like a bilateral relationship in this type of international cooperation, and that translates into a correlation between beta ij, the value that J puts on I, and beta ji, the value that I puts on J. And this type of reciprocal behavior holds within and outside formal institutions. For example, membership in the WTO, countries that are participating in preferential trade agreements, and it also holds in changes for our sample period between 1997 and 2019. Okay, so that's the overview of the paper. Now let me go into the two pieces in more detail. I'm going to start here with the theory, and the goal is to derive this optimal tariff with as-if altruism. All right, so our environment here is going to be one in which we have several countries. Countries are going to be indexed by I and J, as I introduced in just a few slides ago. And we're going to have countries trading goods. Goods are going to be indexed by G. And you can, to fix ideas, you can think of a good as a triplet. It's an origin, destination, product. Product for us later on is going to be an HS6 product. The supply side and the demand side are going to be kept pretty simple here. On the supply side, we're going to have a representative firm in each country I that is going to produce a net output, a vector of all the goods, subject to the technological constraints of that country that are going to be summarized by this set capital Y here. So this is going to be a big vector with all the goods. Positive entries are output, negative entries are inputs. So it's going to be a way of just organizing how we can think about production decisions in the country here. The demand side, we are going to have a representative agent in each country J. It's going to consume the same goods. The vector of consumption is going to be CJ here. That includes all the goods in the economy, and that is going to do some utility U of C. The government is going to be able to impose trade taxes. We are going to use specific trade taxes here. They are going to simplify our derivations. So the idea is that the country can pick country J can pick a tariff, a specific tariff T on good G, and that is going to open up a wedge between the domestic price of that good, that's the PGJ there, and the world price of that same good. So tariffs will essentially open up this wedge between the price in the world economy and the domestic price faced by consumers and firms. And all the tariff revenue is going to be rebated with lump sum transfer to the consumer here. And we are going to have in equilibrium market clearing, which in this case is very simple. The entire vector of consumption across all countries, when you sum it, needs to be equal to the entire vector of production across all countries summed. In this case, then, we can just kind of think about a standard definition of a competitive equilibrium with trade taxes. Firms are going to be maximizing profits. Individuals are going to be maximizing utility given the domestic prices. The government budget needs to be balanced. And all the markets for goods here need to clear. All right, so that's our setting here. It's kind of a somewhat general setting, the way we think about it. Now, the main contribution is going to be thinking about how countries will make their tariff choices. So the standard approach would be to, at this point, model the entire rules of the trade agreements that are going to be affecting how countries select their tariffs. We're not going to do that. We're going to take an alternative approach. The way we're going to think about it is that there is, a constrained maximization problem that governments will solve in each country, taking as given what other countries are doing. And the idea is that these countries will have this altruistic motive. They are going to be internalizing the impact of their policies on others. Formally, what does that mean? You can think about the tariffs in country J as being the solution of this maximization problem. So country J will be maximizing its own utility, UJ, but it will also take into account in that maximization problem the utility that its choices will induce for trading partners I. And lambda ij is going to be essentially how much the utility of that partner I will be valued by country J. And that's going to be subject to the feasibility constraints. You need to be able to deliver utilities that are within the choices that you can achieve with your own tariffs, conditional on the tariffs that other partners will be setting. That's the T minus J there. That's essentially the tariffs of the partners that the country J will take as given. All right, so what does this mean? Let me just go to two extreme cases to just illustrate what we can cover with this setting. So the first one there that I have is a one-shot Nash. In this case, countries don't internalize at all what's going on with their trading partners. And if you have a two-country setting with two goods, you're going to get your standard way of representing the Nash equilibrium here. Countries are going to be on their best response, and then you're going to be, the equilibrium will be on this intersection here, where each country is actually selecting its best response given the others. And this, in our case, is essentially setting the lambda ij to 0. So you only care about your own utility, you don't care at all about your partners. On the other extreme, you could have global efficiency. This is as if there is a representative global planner setting tariffs everywhere with the same transfers. With the same utility, the same objective function here. This would be, it's a particular way of cooking up these lambdas here. They have the same ratios everywhere. But visually, what does that mean is that these utility curves here need to be tangent at the point in which the global planner would be picking those tariffs. So these would be the two extreme cases covered in the literature, non-cooperative tariffs, fully cooperative tariffs. Our setting actually allows for something in the middle, and you can think about these lambdas as being ways of rationalizing different types of equilibria that could arise in the economy depending on the underlying institutions governing this game. Okay, so in this general setting, we're going to have our first proposition here. That's going to be the key thing that we use in the data. So we are going to derive the tariffs that countries effectively choose. That's the tariff in black there, that country J selects for good G. And deviations from that tariff, from the opportunistic tariff, those that would arise in a one-shot Nash equilibrium, are going to be related to what we call altruistic motive here that emerges in equilibrium of this model. So this altruistic motive is going to capture the impact of changing tariffs through the imports that it generates on the real earnings of trading partners I. So essentially, think about raising your tariff, will decline your imports, that will affect income across the world, and you care about that. How much do you care about that? That's going to be regulated by beta ij. It's essentially the valuation of country J for these transfers to partners I induced by imports, so the sensitivity of real earnings to the imports relative to J's own residence here. And you can see that if these beta ij's are all zero, then we are back to the opportunistic tariffs, we are back to the non-cooperative equilibrium. And in between, we could have different cases, and the extent to which this beta ij differs from zero or something like the cooperative tariffs is going to tell us how much cooperation exists in the world trading system. And as we're going to show later, it's also going to be informative potentially about the mechanisms in the background generating cooperation between countries. So now let me move to the second part of the paper, where we're going to actually put this tariff formula to work to answer our question, a world trading system for whom? So the idea here is to really rely on this formula for estimation. So we are going to take it to the data, the formula from before. So the only thing that we change here, we put a residual. It could be measurement error. It could be other motives for tariffs, for example, correcting externalities in the background or redistribution. So this would be the residual epsilon gj there. And then what we are after estimating these beta j's, our metrics of cooperation. We're going to do so for 28 economies in the world. We are going to take the 26 largest trading partners plus the EU and bundle all the other economies into the rest of the world. It means that we are going to cover in our sample something like 93% of world trade, so the vast majority of it. We are going to focus on the varieties that account for 90% of the imports of each country. That takes us to something a little bit above 200,000 observations that are going to be defined as origin, destination, HS6 triplets here. The key thing that we need beyond the tariffs that we observe in black there are going to be these metrics of the opportunistic tariff and the sensitivity of real earnings to imports. These are not readily available in any data set. So the way we're going to do that is to set up a quantitative model of the world economy. It's going to be a multi-sector gravity model, pretty standard, with some modification using asset preferences to account for the different products that we have, the 200,000 goods that we are going to include into the analysis. We are going to do two extremes, fully mobile labor, specific labor, and then we are going to calibrate the model in a standard way to match production and trade data in the world economy. Okay, so here's our first result. These are the betas that we observed between the partners in our sample. You're going to see the first thing to take away here is that they are actually pretty far away from zero. Actually, zero would be no cooperative tariffs at all. The average is 0.8, as I mentioned in the beginning. We statistically reject that the vast majority of those are equal to 0. So that means that there is quite a bit of cooperation here. 0.8 means that for the typical relationship, countries are valuing transfers to partners at 80% of the value that they would place on the transfer to a resident. So there is quite a bit of cooperation here. The second question that we're going to answer is this tariff setting efficient? As I mentioned, this would mean that there should be not too much heterogeneity in the betas, because this would mean that there is like a global planner setting tariffs. It turns out that, as you saw here, there is a lot of heterogeneity. So because of this heterogeneity, we are going to be rejecting efficiency, and essentially this means that there is kind of dispersion in the betas above what would be allowed by a planner setting tariffs. So that's our second conclusion. Although there is quite a bit of cooperation, it is actually not efficient, at least not in 2001, and true for other years as well. Now, our second finding is this reciprocal behavior that I mentioned in the beginning, is the idea that maybe countries are going to be exchanging favors. So if you extend favors to your partner in the form of a more cooperative trade policy, you're going to receive the same in exchange. And this is thought to be a way of sustaining international cooperation. So here's what we find. So these are the economies in our sample. On the horizontal axis, that's the typical value that one of these countries places on their trading partners. And on the vertical axis, it is the value that this country receives from their trading partners. You see a very strong positive correlation. So the countries that tend to set their trade policy in a cooperative manner will also receive in exchange their partners setting their tariffs in a cooperative manner. This holds in 2001 in the cross-section, holds for most years. It also holds in changes. Countries that start to cooperate more also receive more cooperation in exchange. And you can see that India was in the very bottom there in 2001, but it moves up because it actually starts to cooperate over time. In exchange, it gets cooperation from other partners. So India moves from the bottom to the top when you do changes, for example. All right, so I'm already out of time. So we look at this. It holds within and outside the WTO. It holds over time. For example, we do this for the US-China trade war of 2018-2019, and you can see very clearly the type of behavior, reciprocal behavior that we are uncovering in the data. All right, let me conclude here. We are looking into this form of thinking about international cooperation that we can uncover from tariffs. We see that there is quite a bit of cooperation. It's not efficient, but there is this strong reciprocal bilateral behavior in trade policy.
Thanks a lot. And we have now discussant Federico Teti from LMU Munich. That is, no? Sorry. So that has been changed? Okay.
It's been changed, yes.
Okay, sorry, I'm still with the old.
That's fine. Federico is not here anyway. He's discussing another session.
Could you please use the microphone? I can use the microphone. 10 minutes. Okay,
10 minutes, yeah.
Thanks a lot for Zero. So we switched the discussion actually with Fedor a few days ago. So I was delighted to discuss this paper that was nicely presented by Rodrigo. So let me jump directly into. So it's a paper about reciprocal tariffs. There's even reciprocal everywhere in the title, etc. And so it of course gets us back to those questions of reciprocal tariffs and trade wars, right? So Trump once said, essentially, trade wars are good and easy to win. That was Trump 1. The economists respond, well, yes, the trade wars are easy to win when you want to pass all the costs to your consumers. That's the Fashkenbaum result from 2020. And I wanted to get back to this Costino-Rodriguez-Clair paper, and I'll show you several pictures of it. And the common theme is that, yes, trade wars can be good in our current models if nobody retaliates. The optimal tariff is actually 20% for Costino-Rodriguez-Clair. I'll show you that. It's much higher here, and I'll get back to that. And so optimal tariffs means, it's optimal to put tariffs, so trade wars are good. But if anybody retaliates in this framework, you actually gain into losses, 3.5% for
So they're not so good at all because countries will retaliate. And so this paper is exactly about that. It's about how much cooperation do you get into the world system compared to the optimal tariff. And this is a very nice thing. Okay. Well, Trump too seems to have understood that. Is that there, of course, there's going to be retaliation. I need to pressure those countries so much that they won't retaliate at all, and therefore it's good and it's easy to win. Well, easy in terms of if you're easy in terms of geo-economic pressure. So here it's very nice. You get this 20% BIJ. I mean 0.8% BIJ. So it's sort of refreshing that countries are sort of not always in a non-cooperative path. They seem to be cooperative to a very large extent, 80%. That's huge, actually. And maybe it explains non-retaliation by countries. We'll maybe can have a discussion about that later. It's a very crisp, very elegant paper and very insightful. With it. You saw that equation. I want to say that I hate the notation, though. The T hat GJ is actually bilateral. So it's like a set of bilateral tariffs. So think about what is the deviation that I put on a tariff on my partner compared to what I should put, should I believe essentially Costino, Rodriguez-Clair, all those models, quantified models, okay? Beta ij is the dose of altruism. I don't really like this as if altruism because I don't really completely understand what you mean. In this paper, there's this figure 1. You presented A and B, but I'm more interested in C, actually, where you can see this Nash equilibrium with this intersection of the reaction function. And then you see full collaboration, but then you see also partial cooperation. And I think that's what they are about, is that you might have a self-interest in trying to avoid a trade war. And I'm not completely sure from reading the paper whether you mean that in terms of altruism or not. And because I would have defined altruism as I understand that the dynamic game is going nowhere. I want to avoid this war. I want to do WTO. And altruism is something above that because I love my other countries. And that would be my altruism. It's terminology, but it sort of matters to understand where you are in literature. There's a number of puzzles on the tariffs that the first one is that your final result is that even if you control for PTAs and WTO, you still get some reciprocity, and therefore some sort of bilateral thing. So, and I wonder. So actually, it would be good to tell us what in the data is this reciprocity that is not Article 24 of GATT, that is not PTA. So it would be good to actually show us what are those things, okay, with non-WTO. There's this very mysterious thing where you have sector-specific fictitious products that accommodate domestic trade flows, so that's a technical nitty-gritty thing, but I don't know what those fictitious self-trade. It's actually completely critical in those models, so I really think you need to define what are those fictitious products for domestic trade flows. And those are really important because there's actually other database where you can use this internal trade flows. Fyodora is not here. I'm just wondering why did you not use MagMaps as a default, because it actually is a data set that has all the bilateral obstacles at the bilateral level. Okay, so let me go back to Costino Rodriguez-Clair to talk to you about optimal tariffs. So there's this very nice graph in Costino Rodriguez-Clair chapter, Bible chapter, which is telling you that you see the optimal tariff is about 20%. You see those curves are welfare if you put unilaterally the optimal tariff. And you see that Ireland, USA, France, and Portugal all peak around 20%. And they explain that in the chapter, that this peak around 20% is just a 1/5. And 5 is what? 5 is the epsilon, is the trade elasticity. So this is sort of weird thing that there's a very complex model which in the end turns out to be almost exactly like the very simplistic formula that 1 over this 1 over epsilon. You have 3 elasticities here. It's a much more complex model. 1.19, 1.5, 2.5. The average is 1.75. You take 1 over this average, turns out to be 57%. Your optimal tariff is 55%. Another miracle. And that's a puzzling miracle for me because it's a way more complex thing. I mean, Isabelle didn't get the appendix. I got the appendix. Don't read it. The appendix C4 is going to kill you. So this is a really, really very difficult model, and actually getting the optimal tariff is very hard. And in the end, you get this super simple formula, so that really puzzles me. What puzzles me even more, Ralph must be in the other thing out there, is that OSA 2014 AER finds 56%. That's the baseline thing. But their epsilon is 3.5, which is quite different. So now I'm really puzzled because OSA is doing Nash, this one is doing Nash, and they find different results, and it's sort of is a puzzle to me. The other puzzle is that this is OSA, JPE paper, 2014. This is the matrix of optimal tariffs. You see this matrix of bilateral optimal tariffs? They're all the same, essentially, 27, 28%. Here, in this paper, it's very different. So you got this average T hat across G, and you see USA, you see Sudan and Laos out there. They're very different. They vary a lot depending on your openness. So again, that's just a puzzle to me. How do you get that, which is way more intuitive than that? But how do you get it? Because those other guys didn't get it. So I would really be curious about that. And on the main results, what I was wondering is that this delta omega of delta M, which is essentially how much income of your partner do you hurt or increase if you increase your imports? Do you get this as sort of a reduction 1 by 1? Do you do those things? I was just wondering how you do it because you didn't describe it exactly. How do you do that computation? I would really love to see that scatter. You see those things that you showed us, the heat map. It's actually very hard to read. I would like to see that as a scatter against bilateral trade, so that to understand what is a pattern here. And the final thing. So the rich countries in the final table that you didn't show us, this beta ij, this sort of altruism, the rich countries seem to be nice, in the sense that the beta ij higher the richer you are in both imports and exports. So that the rich countries are nice. So I was really wondering, and maybe I got lost at the end, but did you look at how much of that is to be nice with respect to poor countries? So how much of that is maybe GSP? And I was really interested in the Trump thing. Is the US nicer than the rest of countries are nice to the US? Does your paper find that the US is getting abused by the other countries in terms of their beta ij? Maybe you do find that. I don't know if you showed us, but I
see puzzled faces, but
thank you.
Thanks a lot. We have now. Why don't you come here? And again, if there's an urgent question, I'll take it right now before you start reacting. 1, 2, 3. Nobody? Okay, I have one, but you go first.
All right, thank you, Thierry. Thank you for this great discussion. It's very useful for us. We are thinking about how we are going to revise the draft right now, so this is going to be very useful for us. The notation, yeah, it's always a work in progress, so we can talk a little bit more. John will have stronger opinions about that than I will. But let me just kind of start actually with the big picture question that you concluded. Like, we're actually thinking about, I guess we were writing this paper last year. Lots of things changed in the past year. And one of the key questions they were thinking about is the one that you concluded. Is it room for the US to gain more by diverting from the patterns that we saw here? And even like is the U.S. and if was the U.S. special in any dimension on this cooperation that we saw before. So far, preliminary results don't seem like it. You can look in our scatter plots. The U.S. is right on the line across the countries. It is not an outlier on the type of reciprocity. If you look at we estimate the reciprocity coefficient of this beta ij on beta ji of each of the countries that we have. There is not a clear outlier there. And that is true even for countries that were not in the WTO in 2001, like Saudi Arabia and Russia. So it is not very clear that that was the case. It is true that once you go for these betas or this measure of cooperation that is about internalizing the impact on others, the mapping from tariffs to that is a little bit less clear. So it could be that you need different tariffs in order to deliver the same utility or the same value to your partners. And you alluded a little bit about that. One of the key things in the model, which I have to think about why it's not in OSA, but I know what is in our paper. It is about the elasticity of substitution. What is your ability to find other partners to provide you with the goods that you are buying from one of your partners? And in this class of gravity models, that is very related to how big you are relative to your partners because of the IIA property, as we were discussing in the previous paper. So that's kind of how size actually matters here. It is about this elasticity of substitution, so it kind of pops up very naturally in the paper. And we are kind of like trying to find ways of better visualizing what in the data is delivering the results. It is in some metrics of tariffs, so I'm happy to discuss more with you, get your suggestions on that. I think we're trying to find ways of uncovering this more to the reader. All right.
Thanks a lot. Oh, yeah. Okay. Many.
So I wonder if I think about countries that want to hurt other countries, say sanctions and so on, so would that be a very low beta or a negative beta? So how to think about that in your framework?
Can I actually add to that? I was going to ask the same question. I would see it more in the lambda parameter, right?
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I meant the lambda. Right?
Yeah. The lambda could be negative with Trump, right, or other people. Sorry.
Yeah, because empirically you don't find negative ones, right? So do they map? Can there be negative lambdas?
Can I?
Yeah.
So so the beta and the lambdas are very related to each other. It's just that you have to adjust something by the price, but so they mean kind of the same thing to some extent. You're right. It could be negative in principle, and that would be one version of what you're saying. Like you really dislike some other country for whatever reason here, but it could be negative. It's just that we don't find many of those. They are not in the data, at least like the way we estimate things. We are not uncovering like negative betas. They are all positive, essentially.
You have that in the sanctions literature, right? When you want to hurt somebody, so the lambda there is definitely negative. It's just that then in these cases, usually you have non-tariff barriers.
Oh, okay.
So that's why that's for you difficult to capture, and a lot of these have been imposed very recently. But that, I think, would be the case where you would expect to find negative numbers.
Yeah, no, that is fair. So you could start to think about bringing other tools to the measurement, tools that affect trade policy, trade between countries to the measurement of these. Actually, the way you derive the theory, since this is coming from the force-order condition from the planet, if you're optimizing on other things, our formulas still hold. It is just that we don't have them in the implementation yet. So that would be like a nice suggestion for something that could capture this. It could be also related to the period that we are looking at. So we are not looking at a period in which there is a lot of disputes between the countries in our sample. And in other periods, they could emerge. We just haven't done beyond 2019 yet.
You could take the 1930s.
If we have all the data, we could do for many other years. That would be an interesting exercise for sure.
I don't want to monopolize. I have actually one further question, if I can, which is that 2001 is also about when the China joined the WTO, right? And there's a big discussion in the US. Oh, we let them in because we thought they would become like us, and look what they have done. And now what they have changed is even at more or less unchanged tariffs, the elasticities, the shares, right? And the, let's say, the perceived welfare gains from trade have radically changed because of the growth of China, right? Where would you capture that in your model?
So the way you can think about it is that in the sensitivity of imports to income, that is an equilibrium object that depends on who you trade with and how big those countries are. So now that you trade more with China, affecting your imports may be more or less effective into changing the real earnings. So that metric, through the lens of the model, which is intended to capture the initial level of trading every year, will be incorporating that. That would go into that object. I didn't spend too much time on it, but that is the place.
Thanks a lot. I encourage people to take the last minute we have to ask a question, but if it's not the case, then we will finish 2 minutes early. Have a happy coffee break. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Welcome, everybody, to a big highlight of the conference. The first big keynote by Ken Rogoff. We are extremely happy to have him, that he agreed to take the long flight and join us to give a keynote for this conference. Before I hand over to Ken and give, there's not much I need to say about Ken. He's one of the eminent macroeconomists of our time, so I'll be very short and not say much more on him. I just want to mention one big piece of positive news. I just talked to Beatrice. We are about to relaunch the Geoeconomics RPN of CPR. Several of you are already members. The Research Policy Network of CPR, as you know, are meant as a meeting place, as a networking place on specific topics. We already have the Geoeconomics RPN, and we're now broadening it to Geoeconomics and Security, also with the support of Ethan Zletsky, who will kind of head this defense and military economics part of the agenda. We sincerely believe that given the enormous increases in defense spending, we need more economists working on this. We need more scrutiny. We need more thinking on how to best invest these resources, how to react to these rising military threats. And the RPN that Beatrice also motivated, the expanded RPN is really an attempt to go there and to increase the high-quality work and policymaker exposure to that work on defense economics. So that's wonderful news, and we'll launch it in the coming days and weeks. With no further ado, Ken, thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours. You have 30 minutes, and then we'll have a 20-minute Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's a incredible pleasure to be here. I have to start by saying, it's so timely to have a Geoeconomics conference. I wonder if you got inspired in part by Trump 1, and who knew, you'd get Trump 2 to turbocharge the topic. I want to thank the CEPR and also Kiel and all the organizers for everything. I'm going to center my remarks around my recent book, Our Dollar, Your Problem. And it gives us, if you read it or heard about it, gives sort of a sweeping history of the post-war global financial system. And I think some of the intellectual history also. I weave in a little bit personal history. I don't think it's a memoir, but I had things I wanted to say, and I felt that if you don't make it a little bit interesting, no one will read it. And I wasn't really just trying to reach policymakers or certainly, the general public, but absolutely the profession. I sort of following up on what Christoph said, the profession has sort of gone off in this direction of many great research ideas, but just somewhat abandoning macro policy in a lot of ways, but definitely political economy. If you study the whole literature on central banking, there are a few exceptions, but it's all like you're setting a switch on a thermostat. It's just setting a rule. there are no pressures, there's nothing going on. And I think economists sort of like that because you don't have to think about game theory, you don't have to think about strategic interactions, you don't have to think about security, and yet it's absolutely fundamental to so many issues, and I try to bring that out in the book. The book's based on many research papers, and I'm lucky to have some of my co-authors here, Ethan, Francesco, and I'll mention some of the others. Where that's a theme. And another theme is the importance of looking at history, and there are many great historians here, Moritz and others, where I feel like when I see a lot of, it's not just commentary, I mean papers in the AER and the JP and the QJ, it's like the last 10 years were all that ever happened, and you don't have to look beyond that to think about things. And sometimes that's right. Sometimes this time is different, and something new is happening that we've never seen before. But I think you lose a lot in that. And I just throw out one example. One former student of mine who's done very well, and I will not name them or try to give any hint, except they had a research job at a central bank before coming to graduate school, which narrows it down a bit. I was working on inflation, and I had a question. This was only 5 years ago. I had a question about inflation, and I asked, and they said, my generation doesn't think about inflation. This is the 21st century. We don't have to think about it. And this is somebody working at a central bank, working in macroeconomics, and I could give many other examples of that. I think it's interesting about the defense research. The last many, many years, I want to say 12 years and maybe more, if you looked at the flow of students coming into graduate school, and I think Harvard was not atypical, they all wanted to be social warriors. They knew they wanted to redistribute income. They knew inequality in Arkansas, such as they focused to concentrate on, is really bad, but it's worse than you think, and that's what they wanted to do. And that's great, and they have wonderful research, but it sort of forgot a lot about macroeconomics. And I mentioned some surveys in my book, which are just mind-boggling, of the American Economic Association. They do these surveys every 5 years. So one of them asked a simple question like, the Federal Reserve should focus mainly on inflation or other social objectives like, employment, but also other things. So in 2000, 80% said inflation. Well, I'm kind of wondering where the other 20% were coming from. But if you went to 2021, it's the last time they did it, it had flipped. It was 80% almost said other things, inflation should be secondary, very much like the student I just said. And there's like a list of these questions. I didn't have it in this edition of the book, but maybe get into the next edition. Someone at Hoover did a survey of the most used words in abstracts in AEA and AFA, abstracts and titles, and they do the 25 most used words. Last 15 years, until this year, inflation did not appear. Debt and deficits has still not appeared. And you can guess, the words are like the environment, inequality, race, decolonialization even made it 1 year, but inflation did not. And I think that one of the things that drove me to write the book, which is, I think there's certainly been interesting research going on, but it hasn't really been a focus. Let me say something about the title. I think a lot of you know this, but maybe you don't all. I certainly never really focused on it as much as I should have, even studying international finance my whole life. The phrase, "our dollar, your problem," comes from John R. Connolly. He was Treasury Secretary under Richard Nixon in the late 60s, early 1970s. He's a very colorful, historic character. He was governor of Texas. He was in the car the day John F. Kennedy got shot, and he got shot. He recovered, and he's became Nixon's Treasury Secretary, and Nixon went off of gold. Now, we kind of thought we went off of gold in the 1930s, but not completely, and not completely in a very important way, which is, although you and I couldn't get gold for our dollars, the Banque de France and the Bank of England and anyone who was an official creditor could. And it was, absolutely a significant part of the post-war Bretton Woods system. There are various reasons. Those of you who've studied international know about the Triffin paradox, why it was eventually going to blow up. But I think it was a bit of a surprise when Nixon did it. It was a big surprise. I think people thought it was many years ahead. And the Europeans, who held a lot of dollar reserves, I don't know if quite as many as a proportion of GDP as Asia holds today, but similar orders of magnitude. And inflation was already rising. And then if they're taking away gold, what are they planning to do? And this wasn't all short-term debt. A lot of it was actually longer-term debt. And so they were furious, the countries that were sort of anchored in the system. And Nixon sent John Connally to a meeting in Rome where he met with people from around the world, but mainly Europeans. And they said, what are we going to do? And he said, well, it's our dollar. It's your problem. And that's kind of always spoke to me because I don't like the arrogance implied in that. I know I'm American, but you'll see I talk about it in the book, my own experiences. But I feel it doesn't serve us well that we kind of need to have allies. And if you want to stay on top forever, you can't treat your allies like enemies. I want to say I finished the book before Donald Trump. I'll come back to that. And it also spoke to me because of the irony of it. I think if we hadn't taken away gold, it might have helped prevent what happened in the 70s, not necessarily completely, but that was a check. It would have, you couldn't have done the inflation levels that we did. I mentioned I did this with an academic press, with Yale University Press, and it was actually finished well before the election. I knew who would win the election. They let me add one paragraph, you can see at the very end, commenting on it. And no one, it didn't come out till 6 months later, and everybody thought, how could you know, they assumed there wasn't this lag, but had I known, I might have been tempted to call it Our Donald, Your Problem. And maybe, excuse me, maybe that's what the sequel will be. There's certainly stuff to say about him, but a lot of the book is not forward-looking. It's backward-looking and trying to provide perspective on what's happened and how we thought about it. But I thought both sides were awful when it comes to macro. I'm not talking about every other thing, but I thought that Democrats had been sort of taken over by the progressives who thought that debt was a free lunch and many, many other things. And they also, I talk about it a lot in the book and I document it, they hate central bank independence. Elizabeth Warren's my neighbor, and I speak to a lot of I've spoken to her chief, economists and people who worked with her, who, by the way, make her look like Ronald Reagan. They're brilliant, but they don't like central bank independence at all. They don't like banks, for that matter. And so I sort of saw this coming in one direction or another. And there certainly, I'll come to it, many things Trump has done at, a lot of, just within this narrow realm, that have been crazier than I thought, but it's certainly good for geoeconomics. As somebody who did political economy, I was just waiting for the second coming of Richard Nixon. He was wonderful. Every conceivable thing the president could do to pressure Congress, and I'd hate to use the word unscrupulous, but very, very hard-hitting. He's brutal. And actually, he says a lot of things like Trump says, but he said them in private. But it's on the Watergate tapes. You can listen to it. He yells at Arthur Burns to go print more money so that he can win the election. And anyway, my prayers have been answered. I just want to mention before I go on, these are things, a couple of them covered in the book, the last two are not. Clearly the coming, if you're I weave the book together by thinking about the rise and gradual possible decline of the dollar. And obviously stablecoins, cryptocurrencies is a big deal. How you handle them, how digital currencies evolve is very, very important, and thinking about that. If you're looking at the tariff war and you're not looking at what the U.S. is doing with stablecoins, you don't have your eye on the ball. I mean, this is a very aggressive policy. I think there are ways in which it's not good for the United States, which I'll come to later. Something that I talk about in the book, I talk about swap lines as one of the ways the U.S. sometimes is nice to people by giving them swap lines. And I mention, but when I think about the loss of central bank independence today, something I hadn't really focused on was, wow, is that going to be a weapon, swap lines? Because the world's heavily dollarized. If you don't know what a swap line is, a lot of places in the world, you have all sorts of dollar assets floating around. Usually it's just fine, but every once in a while, when there's a pandemic, a financial crisis, some other crisis, these markets freeze up. And they freeze up in a way that the national central bank can't help because they don't have dollars to sort of back things and free them up. And it's a problem in the United States, but the Fed can step in. But what the Fed has done, and this goes back to the 50s and 60s, this didn't start under Ben Bernanke. What the Fed has done is give these swap lines where they call it risk-free, but they're not really risk-free loans to other central banks in order to calm things down. Well, if you weaponize that, just one example I should give of that. Korea had, $400 billion or something in reserves at the eve of the global financial crisis. And it didn't matter. It did not matter. The Korean financial markets were freezing, dollar markets were freezing up. The second the Fed whispered that there was a swap line, done, no problem. It's been very important. I'm sure you followed Argentina. I talk about that a bunch in the book, but never imagining this latest phase. But that's an example of how you can use swap lines, particularly if you take over the Fed. When I was writing the book, I certainly was aware that partial default was a possibility for the United States. If we continue to run into debt problems, you usually think of inflation, financial repression, God forbid, raising taxes, as a way of trying to deal with some kind of debt problem. But we did default in early 1930s. Sebastian Edwards has a terrific book on this, and it's very relevant to today because the Supreme Court ruled the abrogation of the gold clauses as a default. They did not rule that Roosevelt didn't want that, but he pressured them, I think threatening to stack the Supreme Court, and they caved, and they said, well, okay, it was a default, but no one was hurt, no harm, no foul. When, of course, if you were the Bank of England or, the Reserve Bank of India, I don't think you felt that way because you held dollars as a form of gold. But we have defaulted. I didn't take it so seriously, although I have some work with Barbara Rossi and Paul Schmelzing where there's some paradoxes in looking at the term structure that are kind of, this is a paper you can find in the NBR, that are kind of hard to unravel if people really think there's zero chance of default. But along comes Trump and Steve Moran. He has a Harvard PhD. I didn't have him in class. I was on leave that year. Maybe it would have changed the course of history if I had it. I don't know. He's a very smart guy, for sure. So he has this thing, I don't know if you heard of it, called the Mar-a-Lago Accord, which is named after the Plaza Accord, which is something that happened with Japan in the 1980s. I'm going to come to it in a slide. And we basically forced Japan to devalue its exchange rate and pressured them to take a whole bunch of other actions. And they had been threatening to surpass us, and this, I think, was the beginning of the end when they went along with us. And Moran said, we should just do the same thing to everybody now, like do it to China, do it to other countries. And of course, just brilliantly called it the Mar-a-Lago Accord. The Plaza Accord's after the Plaza Hotel. And it involves a partial default. I won't get in, you tell the People's Bank of China, yeah, you've got, they say $1 trillion, but it's probably $2 trillion in treasury bills. Well, we're good for it, but not for 100 years. You can have a 100-year bond, and by the way, it won't pay any interest. It's a zero coupon bond. Well, you might need money along the way. Well, you just ask us. We'll give it to you. You can borrow on it. That's a partial default. And much more crudely, in a way, the Big Beautiful Bill contained a tax on foreign investors up until the last minute. If you think this could never happen, you shouldn't be managing money at the People's Bank of China or, frankly, the Bank of England. If you think this could not happen, it is not just Trump. If U.S. runs into pressure, we'll do what's good for us. So one of the points I try to make in the book is that the United States is great. We're always saying that. But it's been lucky. There have been some lucky turns that have taken it to the full extent that it's reached. And I'll come back to that. Certainly one thing that I think has surprised me and surprised everyone was that the U.S. share of GDP, this is a chart that gives the exchange rate, which is the dashed line. That's the easy thing to calculate. And then there's the purchasing power parity, where the U.S. Is smaller than China. And the purchasing power parity is very interesting if you want to ask, is China doing a good job to help its people and such? But you can't buy Saudi oil with purchasing power parity dollars. You need real dollars. You can't buy Patriot missiles. You can't pay for national defense. And so, that's not a completely accurate statement, the last one, but they're international goods you can't pay for. And the fact that the United States has retained such a large share of global GDP, okay, it could change in a lot if the dollar depreciated by 20%, but right now it's about a quarter of global GDP. I think if you'd asked my thesis advisor, Rudy Dornbush, who is a brilliant man, or Stan Fisher, another thesis advisor of mine in 1980, would the U.S. share of GDP in 40 years, 45 years be about the same as it is today? That's you've got to be kidding. Everybody else is going to catch up. That's been a surprise. There are a lot of reasons for it. I think one of them has to do with network economies and the kinds of really big industries that have grown up in the last 20 years especially. But the United States has certainly, stayed very big in a way that I don't think people expected. Now, this is from my work with Ethan, who will recognize this chart, and Carmen Reinhardt. This is, we use a measure of dollar dominance which relates to how central banks choose their reference or anchor currency. And we have a kind of complicated algorithm for saying what that is. You can read our series of papers on this. There are many ways to measure how dominant is the dollar. So one I often hear is if you look at exchange rate transactions, swapping one currency to another, the dollar's king here. So you can look at BIS swap data. It's 90% of transactions have the dollar in it. I mean, there's two sides, so it adds up to 200%. But 90% of transactions have the dollar. And if you want to trade from Argentine pesos to Polish zloty, you go through the dollar. You trade one into the dollar and then out of the dollar into the other. That's the use of the dollar as a vehicle currency. But, you know, frankly, that's a small example of all the things that's going on with the dollar. That's an example where network effects rule. Inflation's not an issue. Default's not an issue. Diversification's not an issue. But if you go to other things like reserve holdings, even pricing, which Silvana has a great paper, 2025 QJE paper I'll mention a little later today, and she will talk about. If you go to many other aspects, it's not the same. And so I would describe, if you look at most people's papers on is the dollar dominant, they give these different things, and you don't quite know how to add it up. And maybe this is slightly politically incorrect, but I use it anyway. It's a little bit like, the story of the 6 blind men, each touching an elephant in a different place, and they come to completely different conclusions about the trunk is a snake, et cetera. They come to completely different conclusions about what they're facing. So we came up with this measure, which we call a portmanteau measure, capturing everything. This is 1950, and dark red represents the dollar block, such as it is in 1950. Europe is in it. The UK is in it. Of course, the ruble Soviet bloc is not in it, the Eastern Bloc. China's not in it. India's not really in anything. It's not really globalized. It's true, there's a bunch in green, which are the pound, and the pound was pegged to the dollar, except when it wasn't. So it's not exactly the same, but, that's fair. There's some, I won't try to, there are countries like Ethiopia and Egypt there, I guess. But if you did this on an income-weighted basis outside the United States, it's Europe is basically the whole dollar block. This is from our 2019 QJE paper. This is where it was in 2015. It's a sea of red. That's the dollar. The pink, the light red's a fuzzier relationship with the dollar. You're not as tightly using it as a reference or anchor currency. You've got Russia and China there. Actually, interestingly and importantly, Europe's gone. And if you think things are forever, nothing ever changes, it's gone. And I would suggest to you that given our promiscuous use of sanctions, tariffs, the fact that we use the financial data that we get through this dollar network, which channels through the United States, we use that for spying. And the rest of the world hates that. I had a major central bank governor come to my office at Harvard 10 years ago and complaining that, it was a he, had just bought something for his spouse in France, and he used Visa. And he said, and this person knew a lot about clearing networks, and he said it really bothered him that Donald Trump could see it if he wanted to. And so there's a lot that the Chinese don't like, and others. If you fast forward to today, I don't have the graph here, but they're in the book. It is loosened because China's loosened. It's taking parts of Asia with it, but it was certainly gentle. So the dollar rose to this prominence, but I think it's had some lucky breaks. And really one was just how far Japan fell. You say, well, of course, think of reasons they aren't welcoming to immigrants and whatever. It didn't have to happen. They had only half the population of the United States. Well, the UK had only a quarter of the population of France, and it ruled the world. And actually, the Dutch florin was the world currency in the 1600s, and they were half the size of the UK. I mean, that's nothing. Japan was coming along like gangbusters. The Japanese stock market was worth more than the U.S. stock market, the market cap. That's what the world thought of Japan compared to the United States. And their housing was worth much more than the United States housing market was worth, even though Japan's 90% the size of California. So we tried various things, and we came up with this idea of the Plaza Accord. I was an economist at the Federal Reserve, unwittingly working on background papers for this. And so the Plaza Accord was intended to have Japan do a 10% depreciation, because they thought, that would help. And again, you can hear Silvana's paper about, well, what would that do? Like exactly what do we think a 10% depreciation would do? But unfortunately for them, when they started letting this is just over the course of a year, the yen doubled in value relative to the dollar. That was not intended. I tell a story that I was a Princeton professor and got to meet with James Baker, and I said I was a little pawn in this, and I worked on it a little bit, and but I have to tell you, I was sort of surprised that Japan was able to control things, and he laughed and he said, well, yeah, he tells the story about the finance minister and the head of central bank said, 10%, you got it done, it's a deal. And they walk away, they had to get permission from Tokyo. 2 weeks later, it was down 10%. And then he starts laughing and he said, thing is, they couldn't figure out how to stop it once it had started. And I use I talk about the Plaza Accord as an example. There are a couple things where I think I was really importantly wrong and rethought things over the years. I've always thought the idea that we did that to Japan was just nonsense, and they did it to themselves, and it was inevitable. And I've reevaluated that. I mean, I think I have some nuance to it, but they should have resisted that much more than they did. There are other points. I think the dollar was lucky. If you French hadn't insisted on putting Greece in the euro, we'd be in a different world where the euro is today. That was a disaster. I think it actually made a very big difference. Portugal was poor, but Greece was just at another level. The fact China pegged so much to the dollar was also very significant. So one of the themes in the book is how China's going to break away because they need to eventually. It doesn't mean you're going to be using renminbi in Paris, much less New York, but it means it'll be more important as a regional currency. By the way, everyone thought that 15 years ago. If you'd read Barry Eichengreen's work, Jeff Frankel's work, if you'd gone to a conference like this, people took it for granted that that was going to happen. If you go back a little further, people took it for granted that China was going to pass the United States and be the dominant currency. You could go to a conference with a group like this, everyone would have agreed on it. I mean, they'd be, well, will it take 50 years? Will it take 75 years? But I'm just throwing that out there from this perspective of, where we are is something inevitable. So I don't have time to go at length about this, but I had a series of papers going back 8 or 9 years at this point about why that wasn't going to happen in China. And I'd had the idea for a long time, but I was very fortunate to run into this brilliant young Chinese woman who was visiting at Harvard, Yuan-Chen Yang, who was very bold to question what was going on. She had worked with the national, a lot of their National Statistics Agency data, knew it very well. And we put together a bunch of research on how crazy the infrastructure housing situation was in China. So this is using direct and indirect demand for infrastructure. It's very big. But the most striking figure I think we had was, and this is in our paper for economic policy from a year ago, was how much they built. This is housing. You could do the same thing for infrastructure. Many of you have visited China, and you should if you haven't. But if you go to the big cities, you're kind of like blown away by everything. But what you don't know, if you don't really go to rural China, is it all looks the same. You can go out to the farthest reaches, and they have these office buildings. They have these houses. Admittedly, they seem like they only have 3 plans for office buildings and houses. That's how they do it. But they built a lot. And so we argued that they were running into diminishing returns. And I think housing prices are collapsing now. When we first circulated these papers, we were told that's ridiculous. Housing prices went up this year in Beijing and Shanghai. That's just never going to happen. It's never going to be a problem. But what we took advantage of is even though the Chinese won't share anything much about price data, youth unemployment, they're very proud of how much they built. So we had really good data on that. And we were able to put this together. And the problem is now that their house prices are falling, and given other controls they have, this gives 2022 and 2023. It's again, this is from a JIE paper last year. It's a huge percentage of their wealth. No wonder nobody's spending money. They have no Social Security, no medical care. If you're an immigrant, you have to pay for your education. So there's been this collapse. And I will say one more thing about it, which is not only when we first started showing these papers, even to our colleagues at Harvard who'd written about it, and certainly to people at leading universities in the U.S. and China, they all said it was ridiculous. The Chinese would not cover this work. You could not talk about it. Wan Chen felt she had to bring her parents to the United States, being a little nervous. And, I would say now in China it's very widely accepted. She was jointly awarded the equivalent of the Clark Medal in China. I don't know how old she is, 32 or something, just this year, based, I think, on this work. So that's a very official prize. So it's been recognized. So Francesco Papada is here. And this is from a European Journal of the European Economic Association paper with him, where I'm showing the underground economy in Europe. And there are different measures of it. And and why am I segueing to this? I've talked about China, I've talked about Japan, I've talked about the euro. Crypto is another competitor for the dollar. And where the crypto is here and now is in the underground economy, which we think is really big. There's a World Bank study that collates many, many other studies. They come up with an estimate for advanced countries, 17% of GDP, and for developing economies, 33%. These are staggering numbers. These are our estimates for Europe, and I don't have time to explain what we did, but we think we found a much more algorithmic way to do it based on value-added taxes. You're welcome to read the paper. My colleague Stephanie Stancheva, who won the Clark Medal this year, she's French-Bulgarian and has worked on the underground economy for Greece. She looked at our results and she said, that can't be right for Bulgaria. It just can't be. And I said, why? It can't just be 20%. You haven't been there, but that is a home for crypto in a place where it's already competing with the dollar. So I've kind of let myself run out of time. So I'll mention I talk a lot about the debt problem, which I see under either country, even if Harris had become president, there's no appetite. We have no more appetite in the U.S. than you do in France to take care of our debt problem. And I don't have time here. Maybe AI will mean we'll never have to worry about it. But I will say about that first, AI, the first order effect of AI for a long, long time is shedding labor, increasing profits. Profits are much harder to tax than labor. Capital is mobile, and capital is politically very powerful, as you see in the United States. And so, and then there's lots of other things. We're economists. We understand their bottlenecks like electricity, building data centers, expertise. And also, if AI really is so amazing, it's going to make interest rates higher. And I don't have a long time to talk about it. I did debates with Larry Summers, Paul Krugman, Olivier Blanchard about their thesis that interest rates would be lower forever and therefore debt was a free lunch. I'm sure I'm being a little unfair to someone, but not that unfair. I did many debates from 2015 on and give some quotes from things in the book. And this is the 10-year inflation index interest rate. And it was really low until it wasn't. And if you look at the history, this is from a AER paper last year with Rossi and Schmelzing, where we look at a very long-run history of real interest rates. They're very volatile. And I actually, I don't have it circled here, but this is the period Larry and Lukas Rachels, wrote a Brookings paper about, saying we're in this era where interest rates are going down forever. And it might be right, but we don't know. So I've completely run out of time. I think one of the things that is just quantum in what's going on with the world is the geopolitical fracturing. Everybody's in shock and awe about the U.S. military power. You shouldn't be if we ever actually have to be on a couple fronts at once. We have cut our spending to the bone. This is from my book, where it fell to 3.6%. It kind of depends on how you count pensions and stuff like that. 3.6% of GDP. It's fallen further. Trump has not raised it, really. He stopped the decline. And I think that's a pressure on all of the world. And I just threw it in there about AI. I retired. I have a lot on chess in the book, and I actually have Magnus Carlsen and Gary Kasparov gave endorsements, and Magnus read it, and Gary may have too, but Magnus read it, and this is my only game over the last 45 years was an exhibition game with Magnus, where I actually managed to make a draw. And I was never going to play again, although I did play a game this year with this, superstar streamer named Alessandra Botez, who has 4 million followers, many of which are tech and finance adjacent. But I've learned a lot about AI over the years, and I talk about it. I don't have time to talk about stablecoins. I will just finish with, this is my 2009 book with Carmen Reinhardt. This time is different. The current book's done very, very well, but not as well as this. This reached 4th on Amazon of all books at one point, behind the 3 Girl with the Dragon Tattoo novels. But we didn't have sex and violence, but we might next time. So anyway, I've gone on longer than I intended, but thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ken. So time for questions you might raise. There's two people. Jonas and Nitya. Okay.
Richard Portis, London Business School and CEPR. Ken, you started off talking about crypto imperialism, and I'm interested in your view about stablecoins and all that. And in particular, do you think that the banks are just going to sit around and let stablecoins eat their lunch, in the sense that won't they really get together, as some European banks have done, in fact, to issue their own stablecoins, and in particular, going beyond that, to tokenize deposits, which it seems to me dominate stablecoins in various ways. Wouldn't that be a more likely outcome than having U.S. dollars stablecoins dominate the world?
So, is this microphone on? Yeah. Very good point. I largely agree with it. But the subtlety is that the reason, so the G30 wrote a report recently, which I chaired, and we argued for that. But the subtlety is that what restrictions are there on the stable coins in terms of identity, in terms of auditability? The Trump administration sort of let the industry alone in the room to write it. And basically, they wrote it so stablecoins are comparable to cash. So if I take $10,000 out of my Bank of America account, it will actually get reported to the Federal Reserve. And but then after I give it to Maury, they won't know that. And anything Maury does with it, they won't know that. That's how stablecoins are designed. Once they're out in the wild, they're Bitcoin. And please don't tell me that blockchain can be traced. It's very expensive if you don't have a lot of information. So I've argued that what they did is penny wise and pound foolish. They think they're getting money off the rest of the world, not realizing, if you go to the slides I showed of my work with Francesco, there's tax evasion in the U.S. is easily $1 trillion a year, and I don't know how much they think they're saving in interest. So the reason people prefer dollar stable coins to whatever the ECB is going to do is, of course, the ECB is not going to let this happen. It's stupid. The Chinese are not going to let this happen. So it's a weird situation. This is on top of what you usually read about, which are all the bank runs and stuff they're going to be, which I think is actually second order compared to this.
We can take two more questions because we're pretty short on time.
Arnaud Mel, ECB. I bought your book and I read it and I loved it, especially the personal anecdotes. If I
well, you can just stop there then.
Okay. Okay, then I stop. No, the book's title is "Our Currency or Problem." So, is the dollar a problem for Europe? And if it is, what should Europe do about it? Which is within the, let's say, political feasibility constraints.
Mortuller from the Kiel Institute. Ken, thanks so much. Let's stick with exchange rates. The Chinese renminbi has, you talked about the yen in the 80s, the Chinese renminbi has devalued about 20-25% in trade-weighted terms in the last 2 years. Surpluses are expanding, global imbalances are back. What do you think is what's the end game there? How do we, against sort of the mirror of the Japanese story from the 1980s?
So, starting with the question about what Europe to do. So, the reason the dollar is so influential is dollar markets are important, and particularly in financial markets. And when the Federal Reserve decides to do something, either because it's in the U.S. interest but not in the rest of the world, or they're just making a mistake and it's not in anybody's interest, it creates problems for everybody. There are so many papers on this. I think Europe could expand the footprint of the euro, and the the thing that's really powerful about the dollar is that it's the back office to the world. Through our military power and through the size of the dollar, we have gamed things that way. You can look at things Johnson did, Reagan, Nixon. We have forced the back office of the world, SWIFT, the clearinghouses, to go through the United States. That is a bigger source of power than anything. And new technologies give an opportunity to separate from that. And of course, I mean, the biggest problem for Europe is it's not a geopolitical power. That's fine. But if you want to be a global currency at the level that I think Europe could be, you have to be. And the book has a lot about this, about why you have. It's not just you can make your money safe. It allows you to influence negotiations. There's countries within your security perimeter are more likely to use your currency, et cetera, et cetera. On Maritz's question, I think the value of the renminbi doesn't matter, at some level. They're breaking away. And using the classification system I have with Ethan and Carmen, what for a long time, all of Asia, you could just fix to the dollar. And you were fixing to China. But now you're not. And that's going to become more volatile, more dramatic. And they're going to need to develop ways to do that. I think in the long run, China has to have its own pathways, its own clearinghouses. And if you want to tell me nobody trusts China, there are a lot of countries that trust China as much as the United States. That difference is not so great. And I don't know, this is sort of a random thing to finish on, but I heard from an Asian policymaker the other day of the U.S. and China are fighting, and we're stuck in the middle. And, we feel like the children of divorced parents who are fighting. And it's very hard on the world when we're in this more volatile system. But anyway, thank you.
Okay, thanks again, Ken. This concludes the session, and we now move on to the next.
All right, so welcome. So I'm going to be the chair of this session. I'm Michael Porcelacchi. I'm a postdoc at the Kiel Institute. So this session is going to be about decoupling and geoeconomic pressure. We start with Chris Clayton. Want the slides?
Okay. So wonderful. Thank you all for being here, to the organizers for having me, and to, oh dear, the wonderful co-authors whose name had been censored here. Okay, oh good, now it's working. So hegemonic countries like the US and China use their strength from their trade and financial relationships to pursue geopolitical and economic goals. This practice of geoeconomics is obviously familiar to everyone in this room, and I don't need to go too deep into the examples. Everyone here knows it. It's things like semiconductor restrictions from the US by export controls, rare earth sanctions, the Trump administration's use of tariffs as negotiation tactics. And so what I want to do today is think about how we can systematically characterize how firms are responding to these pressure instances. And so what I'm going to leverage is a combination of a large-scale availability of textual data from firms in the form of earnings calls and analyst reports, where you can see detailed discussions where the firm will discuss, we are undertaking these responses to these policies, and it's having these effects on our profit margins. And we're going to leverage advances in large language models to take this large availability of textual data and turn it into hard data that then we can analyze and see kind of what's happening
from these firms' perspectives. Then we're going to trace out some stylized facts about how firms are responding to geoeconomic policies. For example, we'll show that export controls are going to drive R&D by the firms in the targeted countries, that sanctions are increasingly driving supply chain adjustment in response, that there's both winners and losers in trade wars, and that the winners are actually the ones who are less reliant on foreign input, and so are able to benefit from their competitors being hurt by the tariff policies. We'll also kind of do some, at least initial pass, bringing theory to data by showing that the US is actually targeting choke points, or the sectors that are identified as choke points, with export controls. And then, these techniques are very new to me. One thing that my co-authors have taught me is that they actually come with a lot of potential for noise and measurement error. So towards the end, I'm going to tell you some about what we've done to validate our results. Okay, we're contributing to two big literatures, one on text in macro and finance, the other on geoeconomics. This one I could spend 20 minutes just going through everyone in this room who's contributed. So in the interest of time, let me move on. Okay, so high level, what we're going to do is we're going to take a large set of text from earnings calls and analyst reports. You can see this is like nearly 800,000 documents in total, and these aren't, simple paragraphs. These are long documents. And we're going to design a set of prompts that the LLM will then analyze and give us structured output for. So you can think of this as like the LLM version of what we used to give some poor RAs to do to read these documents and answer a bunch of questions. In particular, we're going to focus on a subset of geoeconomic policies, export controls, sanctions, and tariffs. Nice thing about this methodology is you can scale it up to other policies with time and money. And then we're going to ask a bunch of questions about whether the firm's affected, which country's the sender and the receiver of the policy, which inputs are being used in the policy, and what the firm's responses are. For example, changes in investment, changes in sales prices, supply chain adjustment, and so on. We're going to combine this with including calls from China so that we can also see what's happening to Chinese firms in the process. And we're going to do this over a couple different models, including from Google and Meta. So at a high level, what we're going to pick up here is, I think everyone in this room knows the example of ASML. Essentially, we targeted foreign direct product rule to ASML to get them to stop selling lithography equipment to Chinese customers as part of our tech-based export controls. So what the LLM is going to do is it's going to see ASML talking about being affected by these secondary sanctions in their earnings calls. And so it's going to pick it up, it's going to give structured output that then says the countries imposing the controls are the US and the Netherlands, the country receiving the controls is China, the products being targeted are the lithography tools, the impact on the firm is negative, and that negative impact is coming through lower sales to China. And of course, the nice thing about this is we can scale it up. We know the example of ASML from the Financial Times and other news sources, but we can do this across firms, look at a whole possible set of firm responses, and capture also things like the counterparties in China and how they're affected. So to kind of spell this out, I'm going to go through each of these prompts pretty quickly because we don't have a lot of time. So let me start with export controls, then I'll do sanctions, and then lastly tariffs. So for export controls, essentially what we'll do is we'll feed in a prompt that first defines what an export control is, then asks the LM to flag a firm if it discusses being affected by export controls, and then which countries are the senders and the receivers of those export controls. So first thing we can do is just trace the time series out. Who is being affected by export controls at what point in time? And what we can see here is actually like kind of patterns that match, at least high level, what you might have expected to see. For example, you see surges in firms discussing export controls between the US and China happening around the 2018 to 2020 period, when we know Trump 1 is starting to do technologically based export controls directed towards China. And you also see, like, pretty interestingly, much more recent surge happening between China and the US, which, again, we know is happening from things like rare earths being targeted by export controls. This also highlights, like, one of the nice things about this methodology is we're going all the way up to, I think it's 2025 Q2. You can essentially keep on doing this almost in real time as these calls and reports become available. So then we can break it down. What products are being used in export controls? And this is interesting because we know, like, the kind of basic geoeconomic idea of small yard, high fence. Are there, like, very specific goods that are being targeted for these policies versus much more broad-based targeting? And what we see here is that there's actually a lot of that small yard, high fence idea playing out, where the overwhelming party involved in export controls is the US. The overwhelming tool it's using in those export controls is the semiconductor supply chain. And the primary target of those controls is China. Like, you know, kind of makes sense from what we've seen in the world of where these export controls are manifesting. But then, you know, you also see it going some through other sectors. You can see, like, if you know, are able to trace the lines through these graphs, you can see China going through metals and minerals over to the US as well. So, you know, interesting look into what is being used for pressure. Then lastly, on export controls, we can trace, okay, how are firms actually responding? And so we can, again, ask a bunch of binary flag questions. Is investment going up or is it not? And conversely, is it going down or not? Same for R&D, same for other measures. And trace it out, and we can trace it out both in the sending and the receiving countries. So we can look at how firms on both sides of the relationship are affected by these export controls on a number of different margins. So, you know, first interesting thing you see is there's a lot of heterogeneity in both countries. In both countries, there's firms that report being positively and negatively affected, and those kind of positive and negative reports have some matching with what they say is happening to profit margin and sales quantities. So, like, there's some suggestion of maybe some G effects going on in the background. That's something we'll dive into more, especially on tariffs. And you also see that within the receiving country, there's innovations in R&D, and there's domestic investment taking place, which is telling us about how these firms are trying to work around these export controls and either produce on their own or find alternate suppliers. Okay, so then we can do this for each of these different policies. We can go to sanctions. We can, again, define what a sanction is, ask the binary flag, you know, affected or not, and start looking at what the time series is. This one should be even less surprising, actually. This is like almost just a nice validation graph that, like, a first pass, things aren't going too crazy out of these things. So you can see the first, a bit of run-up between the US and Iran going up to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. You can see around both the Crimea invasion and the full-scale invasion surges in US to Russia and EU to Russia sanctions taking place. And then you can also see around the 2018 episodes surge towards both Iran and China, coming with some of the well-known episodes like Huawei and ZTE. And again, we can dive in, so we can look at how are supply chains adjusting in response to this. Again, ask the questions, are they adjusting? If so, where are they adjusting towards and away from? And trace it out. One interesting thing you already see is that there's actually heterogeneity across these different sanction episodes, where in all of them, you see firms talking about supply chain adjustment. That makes a lot of sense. That's what we kind of, from a basic theory perspective, would expect to happen. But the number of firms talking about it is actually going up in the more recent sanctions episodes. The other interesting thing we see is, like, especially in the China case, we see a much stronger response from R&D and investment than we do in the other episodes. And lastly, you know, the kind of going in on that ability to zoom in on specific episodes or specific countries, we can also do this out for Russia and look at how its firms responded to sanctions. Now, we're going to have to be a little careful here, because there's always going to be the problem that with earnings calls, once a country gets sanctioned, it's generally going to stop holding earnings calls, at least in the US. And so that's going to drop out of the sample. But so then instead we can turn to country sector analyst reports to get a flavor of what's happening. And I'll show you in the validation in a couple minutes that if you correlate what you get out of analyst reports and earnings calls, you get almost exactly the same results, even though they're two very different data sets, which is like kind of staggering, actually. So, you know, here, high level, what do you see? Well, first you see adjustment away from the US and Europe, and a little bit away from some allies. And you see overwhelmingly the adjustment is happening towards China and India. So you can look into, like, where these adjustments are happening, potentially even in real time. Okay, lastly, you know the structure by now. Let me jump into the results. Let's do it for tariffs. First, we can plot out the time trend. First staggering thing is the number of firms talking about tariffs. This is up to 50% of earnings calls in the most recent quarter. So, like, half of firms are worried, or are at least discussing it. And you can also see the spike happening a little less dramatically, but still substantially, in the first trade war. Then you can dive it out. You can look at what is happening, again, in response in both the sender and the receiving countries. Again, you can see the heterogeneity in the response, with some firms in both countries expressing positive and negative impacts. And you can also see, like, actually, especially in the country imposing the tariffs, so like the US imposing the tariff on China, the US firms, for example, are saying their input prices are overwhelmingly likely to rise, and that they're raising their sales prices in return. So suggesting that at least some of the incidence of the tariffs ends up falling back on the country that's imposing them, and their firms adjust in response. You can trace this out. Again, there's the positively and negatively impacted. Overwhelmingly, firms say they're negatively impacted, but there is that subset that reports a positive impact. When you dive into the difference between these two, it's really instructive, because you see the difference is, well, they report positive, negative impact. The positive impact say their profit margins went up because their sales volume went up. What's underlying that? Well, underlying that is they're much less likely to report their input price has risen, so they're the firms that are less exposed to the tariffs, but their competitors are exposed, their competitors' input prices are rising, and so you get a general equilibrium effect where they can raise their prices because their competition is being crowded out. So there's just a lot of great stuff you can dive into with this. Then we can do, like, a fun, like, at least first pass take theory to data. So, you know, in the more theory side of the work I've done, we've done, let's get a measure of power that comes from, like, an ACR-like formula, which is about how much damage is done by cutting off a specific input. That, of course, comes down to expenditure shares and elasticities of substitution as the key sufficient statistics. And, you know, we've highlighted that there's an important nonlinearity that comes with this power measure, which is coming from if you either get elasticities of substitution that are very low, or you get expenditure shares that are very concentrated, or ideally both, then suddenly you get a lot of power from being able to cut off that input. So what you can do is you can map out what is the model implied measure of power that we'll get from hard data. And here it's not going to perfectly line up on the green because the green is for a specific choice of sectoral expenditure share. And then you can ask, what is the LLM producing in terms of which of these sectors are being used in export controls and sanctions? And you can see that there's actually not a terrible match between them. It's not perfect. There's some nice hits, so it's not labeled, but one of the big ones is semiconductors. There's also some misses, including automobiles. But you can see at least there's a clear relationship between which sectors are targeted and which ones our theories tell us give rise to power. So there's some strategy at least. Okay, last thing, I've got a couple minutes. As I mentioned, one of the kind of concerns that these toolkits had, and I have to rely on my co-authors a lot for teaching me this, is about uncertainty, measurement error. Are we going to pick up different results from different algorithms, or by changing the prompt, or is it just going to make up results entirely? So we've done a series of exercises to try and get around this validation. First is we have run this with kind of fixed weight models on our local computing infrastructure so we can get exact replicability of the results. That means we can run the same prompt twice, get the same answers out of the LLM. So that ensures we've got replicability for the future. Second, we've thought a lot about how much measurement error could there in principle be. We've done this by both perturbing prompts in both small and large ways, and by using different LLMs to conduct the analysis. And we've got a lot of reproducibility of the key results of the paper. We've also thought about, well, earnings calls come with a specific set of reporting incentives because it's firms talking about their own company. So you might be worried that you're getting selective reporting. So we also did this with analyst reports, different data set. Shockingly, you get almost exactly the same results out of it, even though it's just completely different data. And then lastly, it's important, it can be important to just make sure that these LLMs aren't collectively making things up. So we've started into a human validation procedure. So let me, in the last 30 seconds, just show you each of these very quickly. So first, we did a bunch of variations in the prompt design and the model choice, from large ones like you don't tell it what a sanction is and let it run amok. And across these different designs, you get reliability ratios, in the range of 60 to 90%, which my more empirically minded co-authors tell me is about what you get from high-quality survey data. So that's reassuring. You can do this for both earnings calls and analyst reports. And you can see just the shockingly positive correlation between the two, where they're almost along the 45-degree line in terms of their responses. And then you can do the human validation. This takes time. We've done it with 500 so far. What you can see is overwhelmingly the three models tend to agree with each other. And when they all agree with each other, the humans also tend to agree with the response from the LLM. But actually, in that small fraction of cases where the LLMs disagree, you also start to get the humans producing different responses from the LLMs. So, this all hopefully gives, a good bit of confidence. It's a super interesting problem. There's a lot of this rich textual data out there that gives us a lens into how firms are responding to these policies. and we've given kind of the first pass deep dive into it. So thank you all very much, and Hélène, looking forward to your thoughts.
Okay, thank you very much for writing this paper and to the organizers for allowing me to discuss this. It's great, super interesting work. I think the paper is updated at a pace which probably exceeds the pace at which I'm reading. So some of my comments, it looks like, start to be addressed by the authors. Obviously, there's very little motivation needed for this type of works these days. I think the way I think about that paper is really an empirical analysis of coercion, in the words of the great Albert Hirschman. And I think if I take a step back, I ask myself, what would I like to know? I like to know who imposes coercion, to whom, how, what are the responses, and are the goals fulfilled? Okay, and so I'm going to a little bit look at what the paper does on all these questions. So the paper uses both these analysis calls and also reports to measure the firm responses to 3 types of coercion, right? So tariffs, financial sanctions, and export controls. It's a de facto, what I would call a de facto analysis. You know, what actually happens as measured using textual analysis. And because these are extremely multidimensional policies, tools, and responses, I think it's very interesting and appropriate to use LLMs. Now, there is obviously this growing literature using computational linguistics and textual analysis. So the initial papers were using a lot simpler in the methodology. You started with a dictionary, depending on what you are interested in. Building on these dictionaries, which were standardized to some extent, you would count instances of occurrences in text. Then you would potentially associate nuances to particular words. So for example, tariffs, you would look around the word tariffs in a text. You would see, is there positivity, is there negativity associated to that? That gives you a sentiment associated with tariffs. You would use these measures of literally counting occurrences to then do some econometric analysis, and you would do some validation with human reading just to make sure that these words that you are counting actually map what you wanted to do. I think this is quite transparent as a methodology, this classic way of doing things. It's kind of easily replicable because you know the dictionary, etc. But of course, it misses a lot of nuances, a lot of indirect ways of talking about something that are not necessarily captured in the specific words that you were actually counting. So this is why this paper is a very interesting way of doing things, because it uses LLM instead of dictionary. It's automated. It allows for much more multidimensionality. It uses a private infrastructure for reproducibility. And the question is it, maybe it's a little bit more opaque as a methodology. Now they start from a very large number of earnings call and analysis report. First stage, they look at the ones that contain references to at least one of the 3 coercion tools, and these are not, literally the words, but, descriptions of what these tools are. The second stage, they look at the structure of the data. This has been explained very well by Chris, and on whether it's goods are sold or purchased, etc., positive or negative effects on profits. So there's a structured data which is generated during the second stage, and the first stage, essentially, they kind of do some check. Now, so on the methodology, obviously the obvious questions are the sensitivity to the prompts and the way of constructing confidence intervals. So I see that you've made some progress. I was thinking, some kind of delta method here. What's the equivalent of a delta method in this kind of space of methodology? And for the validation of results, obviously, given the incredible amount of data that is being looked at here, there's a question of resources, a question of time. I would say probably there's a question of energy consumption as well for the LLMs, and a question of human resource in terms of validation. So I think that's an issue, how we systematize validation of results in that growing literature. Now, I was I was interested by the fact that you have indeed a very strong correlation between the analyst calls and the analyst reports. I don't know if you are the same analyst in both, but in terms of proportions, in the analyst calls and the reports, you have different proportions of mentions of tariffs, export controls, etc. So I don't know, if you could explain a little bit what it is due to. I think there's some different also types of methodology that could be used also in that type of literature. You can use so-called like teacher model and a student model, in which you use validation of humans in between to teach the student model, what the human think about the first labeling of a teacher model, and then use the kind of lighter student model to go through the whole corpus. And maybe that's a way of actually doing a bit more robustness, because you can use that. Maybe it's cheaper, it's quicker to do this. So I think that could be a different way to introduce robustness in this type of methodologies. So that was for the methodological side. Now what are the results coming up? So there's quite a lot of interesting results, and I see you have some additional results on what I have. So that's great. So they have some results on geography of coercion. So here, I think you can do a little bit more in terms of descriptions of why some particular areas are affected than others. I was missing a little bit. Spain had a lot of stuff going on. I was not exactly sure why. I think it would be also good to relate so how your de facto measures relate to objective measures, right? So are we talking about importing firms? Are we talking about exporting firms? So obviously this is going to matter a lot for this type of coercion tools. And I was not always able to relate your realized de facto measure of why these firms is doing some things to some kind of characteristics of the firms. So I don't know if you could match. You could probably do a bit more of mapping in terms of objective measures for firms. And something that was very interesting for me is that, at least in the version I had, when I looked at industrial composition, the oil sector, was not that affected. I thought, well, that's kind of interesting, because, the whole Russian part of the issue here didn't seem to play that much of a role, while industrial metals were systematically very, very affected. And I was wondering why. And maybe you have more answers about that now that you have done some additional work. But one very, very striking thing about industrial metals, so here I just put lithium as an example, is that if you look at what China has done in the last 15, 20 years in terms of placing itself at the center of almost all the industrial metals, certainly all the ones necessary for the green transition, it's extraordinary, right? So here, China came out of nowhere, and now China is at the center of a lithium network. I could do the same thing for copper. I could do the same thing for many, many other networks. So the fact that there has been this strategic positioning of China, is it really why you find that these industrial metals systematically tend to show up very strongly in your measure? I think that's, I would be very interested in knowing that. The other thing that I thought was quite interesting, and maybe you want to discuss that, is that essentially, why are the results so similar for the free coercion tools in terms of industry affected? A priori export controls and tariffs could have very heterogeneous effect on the different sectors. Tariffs protect US industries, export controls prevent China from buying critical inputs. I mean, it was not obvious to me why there was so much similarity in some of your measures there, and why don't the financial sanctions affect oil and gas a lot more. Another thing that I thought was very, very interesting in what you find was that for the free, essentially coercion tools, you seem to find that there is an expansion effect, okay, of some firms. So maybe you broke it up now in R&D and investment. So that I was going to recommend something like that. But still, I think, why is it so uniform across the tools? I was very interested by the fact that you have this market exit, which makes a lot of sense to me. Financial sanctions and export controls may lead to market exit, not so much tariffs, though evidently the size of the tariffs might matter there. So we don't have really this intensive margin in terms of a tariff, which I don't know if you can measure it or not. And tariffs affects pricing more. That makes a lot of sense to me. And everybody affects supply chain, but in particular tariffs. Okay, so I think that's very, very interesting. Okay, let me skip that. One other thing, however, that I'm very intrigued by is specifically the Chinese firms. So in your measure, it seems like the Chinese firms, they react more than the others in terms of expanding, right? So why are they expanding more than the other firms? And that's true for tariffs, that seems to be true for financial sanctions and also the export restrictions. And they tend to exit less also. So what is it due to? Is it industrial policy in China? Is it, if they are expanding, does it mean, but they don't seem to be exiting. So, if you think about supply chain repositioning, they should be exiting and expanding. It doesn't seem to be what's happening in your data. So I'm very interested because obviously that there's an aggregate phenomenon that we have all observed, which is that imports into China have declined a lot while exports of China have increased. So the resiliency of a Chinese economy via strategic independence has been a macroeconomic goal. So are you capturing that? Is it what you are capturing? I think it would be great to expand your discussion on China. Now, in the end, I think what we would also like to know is, did these coercion tools work as intended, right? What you are de facto measuring. So does it mean that the people who have used those tools got the results that they intended to get? And there, again, I think you can do a little bit more kind of geopolitical discussion. It seems like your area and US firms tend to be more aligned in their reactions to these tools. This is very surprising for the tariff tool because obviously that's imposed by the US, right? So I'm not exactly sure what to do with this type of results. You could look whether there is alignment on China for firms in the Belt and Road. So a little bit more of a geopolitical extension here. And this puzzle about the behavior of Chinese firms, I think, is a very important issue currently. So to conclude, I think it's really a great paper with novel and sophisticated analysis. Now, these are the questions that I started out with. And in some sense, so when I look at the paper, so what you are not discussing here is who imposes coercion, okay? You have some discussion on that, but what about retaliation? We want to know a little bit more about this interaction. To whom? Primary sanctions, secondary sanctions? You are not really digging into that. That I mentioned, relate your de facto measures to the characteristics of the firms, importer, exporter, has to matter. Again, this alignment between US and European firms for tariffs seems a bit strange. Complementarity across coercion tools, this is the how. What are the responses? So, this Chinese firm reaction is very interesting and puzzling. What are the policies put in place by the countries of the firms, mitigation or others? Are the goals fulfilled? Well, here, again, if you could match firm with firm balance sheet, I think that would be great. So you could have a discussion of de jure, de facto, a little bit. And the robustness, this delta method style thing that you started to do, I think is really an important contribution for this entire literature. So to sum up, great paper. It's a pioneering contribution, so keep going.
Thanks, Hélène, for the discussion. So I was thinking that maybe we should collect a few questions, and then we will leave the last word to Chris.
speak up a bit. Sorry, I.
Yep. I don't know if it is. Yes, this is about the correlation about the analyst and the evening calls. That maybe there is a co-founder there, and there is the news. So what they are represented is what they do in the what they rate in the news. And this is why, for example, there are another indexes by Dario Calderon's or in the trade policy uncertainty. But I think that these indexes by the news, so it is an uncertainty index, like you. But you point an important point is that a rise in uncertainty does not necessarily mean something negative, because some of the players are being benefited from them. Thank you.
Any more question? Okay.
Okay, yeah, no, so I, totally agree that in general for these policies, there's common information sources like news articles that, like, especially for some companies may be really salient. The interesting thing about the kind of relationship here is, like, these are some pretty in-depth questions, like, is this firm taking positive investment? Is this firm reshuffling a supply chain between two countries? So it's getting down into, like, very specific information that, you might not expect to be as much in the headline news. I agree, a lot of, like, the aggregate trends you would probably produce from, like, both if you did it, like, just as you did this to the news articles directly, and also feeding into the types of questions that the two different parties might be interested in. I'm comforted by the fact that even down on the very kind of specific questions, you see a lot of reproducibility of the results across the two data sources.
Want to answer to Hélène?
No, it's so first, like, let me apologize that, if you've seen the last week of work of, especially my co-authors, was essentially putting together a lot of graphs. And so my apologies that a lot of that was not in the paper. I totally agree with you that, like, thinking about the best practice methodology for these models is really important, especially because they're so new and I think have so much potential. We've started into, our own takes, partly motivated by the real AI people, of, how to structure best practice. And we think that's an important direction for the literature to go in. And I agree with you. There's so many interesting things to throw at here. There's so much that comes out of it that you can look into and try to understand. And I think that's what we're going to be spending a lot of time doing. So thank you very much, Hélène.
All right. Thank you so much. So we have to move to the next paper. So we have Nitya Pandalai-Nayar presenting supply chain risk, trade, and economic fragility, and then is Novy discussing.
All right. Thank you so much to the. Well, I guess this is not my paper, so I can try, but it's not gonna be good. Thank you. So thank you so much to the organizers for putting us on the program and for allowing me to change the paper last minute. The first discussant this morning did not have an appendix. The second one had too much of an appendix. My poor discussant did not have a draft. So if he discusses a different paper, I'm really sorry about that. So this is joint work with Juanma Castro, Vincenzi, Adri Gracio, and Gaurav Khanna. And given the times that we're in, we have to now have a disclaimer, which none of us are feds, but we still have a disclaimer that this does not represent the views of any institution, in particular UT Austin. Okay. So supply chain risks are a key concern for firms and policymakers. There have been increasing reasons why firms have been thinking about the risk in the supply chains, natural disasters, the pandemic, and then increasingly policies that are targeting specific sectors. We talked about some of these in the last presentation. There is increasing empirical evidence evidence, which we have found in previous work, but also that Chris mentioned today, that firms are diversifying or adapting their supply chains in response to the presence of risk to increase their resilience. Okay, this is not a very specific term, but there is evidence of this. And so the question we are asking today is, in a world with complex supply chains, what role does risk play, or the adaptation of these supply chains to risk play in the global distribution of production? So what I'm going to do, again, this is a short presentation, so I'm going to try to squeeze a lot into it, but put a lot of pictures. Hopefully that makes it easier to follow. We're going to have in the actual paper, once we write it, a new general equilibrium model of sequential production, so production in stages under risk. Inputs in each stage of production can be sourced ex ante from an endogenous set of locations, possibly endogenous depending on parameters. Input delivery is subject to bilateral and state-specific shocks drawn from some distribution with a variance sigma square IJS. So I'm just putting the IJS out here now. You know what it is going forward. We're going to have in the paper, I will not show you today, an exact characterization of changes in optimal sourcing shares when bilateral risk increases. Okay, so we have analytics for that, but again, in the interest of time today, I'm not going to show you that. And then we're going to quantify. This model is quantitative. We're going to calibrate the model with 19 stages of production. We're going to use upstreamness measures from Paul's papers, but as applied to manufacturing. So we're going to have 90 stages of production. We're going to implement it on 50 countries. We're going to have a model-consistent estimation strategy for the parameters. So this model also, IIA is going to be violated, so we can't just run gravity regressions. We're going to estimate the model with PPML, and we're going to obtain substitution elasticities in that way. And then we're going to have a number of counterfactuals. So we're going to contrast outcomes in this model to a deterministic benchmark. We're going to show that riskier regions are more upstream, and input prices from these regions are higher. We're going to consider what happens in the model if you increase the risk of upstream stages relative to downstream stages. So we're going to show position effects. And then we're going to look also at cases where you increase risk in a specific origin, for instance, China, or you increase trade costs, for instance, from the US, that the US puts on everybody else. And then finally, we're going to look at reducing the complexity of the supply chain. So how does output and volatility change worldwide if the complexity of the supply chain reduces? Okay, so let me very quickly show you some of the framework. I'm just going to show you the framework and not the full solution, and go straight to the counterfactuals. But I'm happy to discuss later if there's something that you want to know more about. So we're going to have an economy with J regions. So I'm going to use I and J for the regions. There's going to be an endowment of LI workers in each region. On the production side, there are going to be two types of goods. So they're going to be non-traded final goods and tradable intermediate inputs. Intermediate goods are going to be aggregated into S stages of production. There are going to be retailers and who are just assembling firms, essentially, and producers of intermediate goods. Everybody's perfectly competitive. The marginal cost of producing intermediates is just the wage divided by some state-specific productivity in the country. And then there's going to be iceberg trade costs across regions. Production of intermediates is subject to shocks that are going to be drawn from some distribution with bilateral and state-specific variances, sigma square JIS. Okay. The demand side is pretty standard. We have consumers are risk averse. We have log utility and expected welfare is just the expected log quantity that the consumers are going to obtain. Okay, I'm going to show you the decentralization of the model, but the model is efficient. Okay, so keep that in the back of your mind. Okay, so timing. So the model within a period, there are multiple. So within a period, there are multiple steps. So ex ante, retailers in a country are going to place their orders of inputs from a set of locations, J. Okay, so retailers in I are going to place their orders of inputs in a stage from a set of locations, J, to maximize expected profits. Then these inputs are produced, shocks to the inputs materialize, and inputs are delivered. And finally, once with their inputs in hand, retailers are going to complete all stages of production, goods and labor markets are going to clear, and prices are up and down. Okay, so the ex-post problem, so final goods production, again, is competitive. It's just a carbonless aggregator of labor and a bundle of materials, the intermediate inputs, MI. Okay, at this stage, I'm going to allow MI to be any constant returns to scale input aggregator of the delivered intermediate inputs. So you can only use what inputs actually delivered to you. So ex-post, the firms are just choosing their labor input and how much of their delivered intermediate inputs X to use. They're going to optimally use all of the delivered intermediate inputs, since the second stage profits are going to be monotonically increasing in the delivered inputs. So that's the second stage problem that pins down the firm's labor choices and prices. Ex ante, the problem is more interesting. So ex ante, the firms are choosing their input orders, MJIS, from all locations and all stages to maximize expected profits. Okay, substituting in for the prices, we can show that the expenditure share on inputs from location J in stage S, okay, so that's the expenditure share, is equal to the expected output elasticity of the inputs from that destination in that stage. Okay, so here, this epsilon here is just the elasticity of the input aggregator MI to inputs ordered from J in stage S. Okay, so yeah, so that determines the expenditure shares. So this far, this MI, this input aggregator, could be any constant returns to scale aggregator. And now we're going to specialize it to a sequential production function where we can then solve for this elasticity and then do more stuff with the model. Okay, so now I'm going to specialize this aggregator. I'm going to consider a specific sequential production function where in each stage of production, inputs are sourced from locations J and aggregated in a CES structure with elasticity rho. Okay, that is state specific. So this is the within stage elasticity across locations. If I have perfect substitutes, I can allow for zeros. Okay, but in general, I'm going to estimate this, and then if it's not perfect substitutes, you would source from all locations. And then the next stage of production is going to use the previous stage's bundle with some stage weight alpha, and then the new inputs from this stage. Okay, and the cross stage elasticity of substitution is going to be eta. Okay, so you can think of eta as the substitutability or complementarity across stages, and then rho S as the substitutability or complementarity within a stage. Okay, and that can be state specific. I'm going to define, and then so the aggregator MI is going to be the output of the last stage, so YSI, where S is the capital S, and there's going to be the output of the final good is just using labor and then this bundle of intermediate inputs. I'm going to define the CES quantity shares of delivered inputs. Okay, these are quantity shares, not expenditure shares, within stage and then across stages. So I'm going to call the across stage CES quantity share a stage weight. Okay, that's just for convenience. And these are omegas and lambdas. And with that, I can then derive this elasticity. Okay, the elasticity that is going to pin down my expenditure share on inputs from a particular location in a particular stage. So this elasticity is just the CES within stage quantity share multiplied by the stage weight multiplied by the share of that stage in downstream in the final output. Okay, that's what this last term is here. Okay, so we can consider a number of special cases here. So if, for instance, if you have a Cobb-Douglas production function, this whole thing is going to become deterministic. Okay. On the other hand, if you have Leontief, what you're going to get is that the input is only going to contribute to output if its stage is the binding constraint throughout the hierarchy. Okay. So in that case, the expenditure share is going to be the probability that that stage is the binding constraint multiplied by the CES within stage share of that input. Okay, so those are some special cases. It turns out in this setting, we can also derive analytical expressions for how this elasticity changes with shocks from a particular origin, and how this elasticity, and as a result, the expenditure share on that stage changes if the risk of an origin changes. Okay? And we have analytical expressions for all of these. We discussed this at more in the draft that is not yet there, but it will be there at some point. But we have expressions for all of these, so we can then compute these objects fairly easily. Okay, so we can close the model. So to close the model, we can just, we have the implicit functions coming through these expenditure share equations that pin down the orders of inputs from every location in every stage. And then we have a gravity-like equation, okay, in bilateral trade flows in expectation. I say gravity-like because IIA is violated here, so I don't have a simple gravity equation. Okay, there's going to be a JIS term inside this expectation that, I can't separate out and estimate with just a standard gravity setting. Welfare is log utility. Okay, then there's GE equations. I'm hiding them in the appendix and not going to click on that button. Okay, so I'm going to also show you very quickly that we can do some stuff in this model, but one thing that's going to be useful for the counterfactuals is we can decompose welfare changes in the setting across the baseline and some counterfactual, okay, into terms that are somewhat intuitive and highlight the role of risk in this setting. Okay, so a change in welfare across from the baseline to some scenario is going to have terms that come from pure demand reallocation. So if in that scenario, so changes in income from pure demand reallocation, that's the first term, as sort of an income or scale effect. Then there's going to be a change in welfare that comes from a change in the terms of trade, because the prices of all of your inputs adjust given your initial sourcing, okay, patterns before the policy change or the whatever changed in the counterfactual. Then there's going to be a term that comes from, your reallocating of your sourcing towards inputs that give you higher value in expectation, that give you higher value in expectation across all states. Okay? So that's going to be the adjustment of your production function towards inputs that on average give you higher expected value. Then there's going to be sort of a risk recipe for production trade-off. Okay? So this is you see here, there's the risk-neutral expenditure shares, and then your actual equilibrium expenditure shares, and the difference between them. Okay, so this is going to capture how much output you're giving up or gaining on average as your baseline expenditure shares deviate from the risk-neutral expenditure shares. Okay, so this is kind of your output trade-off. And then there are the diversification benefits, which reduce just the volatility of your output from deviating from that risk-neutral towards the risk-averse expenditure shares. So I'm going to show you that decomposition in some cases. Okay, so with that, I have comparative. How much time do I have?
7 minutes.
Okay, so I'm going to skip. We have comparative statics. It matters whether the shock is upstream or downstream, or the increase in risk is upstream or downstream, but I'm going to skip that. I'm going to go straight into the quantification. We're going to use very standard sources for data. They're so standard that I didn't make a slide out of it. 50 countries, 19 production stages in this implementation. To calibrate the model, we need estimates of all the substitution elasticities and the parameters. We cannot, again, just estimate a simple gravity equation here. So what we're going to do is develop a model-consistent maximum likelihood estimation approach. Okay, and we're going to. This is extremely involved, and Juan Ma is, I think, a genius. So he deserves all credit for making that work in the end. But I'm not going to talk about it today. Okay, we're going to compare it with an empirical gravity estimation with additional controls. Okay, this is going to be equivalent to a second-order approximation of the model MLE. Okay, so we are doing both, just in case you don't like the model MLE. So here's the baseline calibration. So what I'm showing you here on the left are the productivities of countries by stages. Countries are sorted by their risk, their estimated risk. Okay, and here I'm showing you the risk itself. This is a lot of information, but basically you see that what we have is pretty reasonable. So countries like Germany and the US are more productive. Countries like Nigeria are less productive. Countries like Germany and Italy are less risky. Countries like Saudi Arabia and Nigeria are more risky, but then there's a lot of variation across stages. Okay? So this is just the goodness of it. The model fits the data pretty well. These are targeted moments, these aren't targeted moments. We think we're doing a reasonable job given the complexity of the model. We're still working to improve, of course, but we think it's reasonable. And then in the baseline economy, just to show you very quickly the heterogeneity we have. So this plot on the left is grouping our 19 stages into 5 sort of broader groups. And you see that there's a lot of heterogeneity again by country. Okay, so in general, less risky countries are more downstream. Okay, but there's again a lot of variation. And then we can compute revealed comparative advantage, and I'm only showing you that because I'm going to show you how it changes relative to a deterministic economy. Okay, so that's on that. I also want to mention that in the baseline model, we have that, I already said that less risky countries are more downstream, controlling for productivity, and controlling for risk, more productive countries are more downstream. Okay, so that's in our calibration. It's consistent with earlier work in this area. Okay, so in the counterfactuals, so first I'm going to contrast what happens in this economy to a deterministic economy, so no risk. So we find that revealed comparative advantage in the risky economy is actually flattening relative to the deterministic economy. Okay, so what is happening here in the risky economy is diversification of production across locations is tilting you away from the locations that would be where you'd source from based purely on comparative advantage. Okay, so the revealed comparative advantage is flattening, although it is fairly slight. I should just turn my back onto the numbers. Okay, and then our second counterfactual, we're going to think about an increase in upstream risk. Okay, so we're going to think about an increase globally in the volatility of inputs that you get in stage 1, and contrast that to an increase in the volatility of the inputs you get in stage 16. Okay, and you see that there are very different patterns. So the upstream when upstream risk increases, you decrease the quantity, although you actually increase the expenditure share of inputs that you get. Okay, and then you need to build that back up. Okay? Whereas when the downstream risk increases, you decrease the expenditure share on the downstream on that sector because it's not so critical anymore for your final output, and you increase it on every other sector before it. Okay, so this is quantities. I should also show expenditure shares, but that's what's happening. On the right, you see the ratio of the volatility of welfare in the case where upstream risk increases relative to downstream risk increasing. You see that everything here is below 1. Okay? So increases in downstream risk increase the volatility of output and welfare less than increases in upstream risk. Okay? So there's more propagation of upstream risk to the volatility of final output. Okay, so we can do a bunch of things. We can think, for instance, of an increase in the risk from China. But what I'm going to do instead is, and so this was my decomposition, but I'm going to show you instead what happens with an increase in U.S. trade costs. Okay, so the U.S. is just increasing trade costs with every country in the world. We see that U.S. production of intermediates increases, every other country decreases. Okay, there's welfare loss for countries in the risky environment is by and large higher than in the deterministic environment, but there's a lot of heterogeneity. And if I look at the decomposition, so this is the U.S. over here. Okay, you see that the results are actually dominated by the income, so demand reallocation terms and the price terms. And so what is happening actually here is that the U.S. is a relatively safe country and a relatively productive country, but in a risky environment, it still wants to diversify. Okay, so when I contrast U.S. sourcing shares in the risky environment, the deterministic environment, the U.S. actually sources relatively more from the rest of the world in the risky environment than in the deterministic environment. Okay, so when the U.S. shuts that down and risk remains, almost every country sees a decline in income. Okay, and so that's what's going on in here. Okay, we can also think about risk in a less complex world. We can contrast. We can do a diff in diff, where we contrast a model with simply 5 stages of production, and we find that by and large, output volatility is higher when supply chains are more complex. But for the riskiest countries here on the right, okay, output volatility is actually lower when supply chains are more complex, because for them, the ability to better diversify their risk through more phases of production dominates because they themselves are risky. Okay, so it reduces their output volatility. Okay, I talked very fast. Hopefully, something came through. But just to conclude, what we have is a new flexible quantitative general equilibrium model of sequential production with risk, and we think we can do a number of things with it that are very interesting, and so I'm happy to hear thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
for having me on the program and being discussed. It was a pleasure to look at this paper. I should also say up front that I'm not speaking. Is this on? Yeah. I'm not here on behalf of the UK FCDO here today. However, there's maybe one thing I should point out. Most of you can't see this. At the bottom of this placard is a Union Jack. So a lot of the CEPR work, especially in that area, is actually funded by UK taxpayers, and that tells you something how the government in the UK thinks about this, and they obviously value that kind of research. But of course, there's other governments involved. Kiel, we are in France, I'm going to say that. All right. Now, in this paper, this is the key research question. We have supply chains, and arguably they've become much more complex over recent years and decades. What role does risk play in the distribution of production? So if you have changes of risk somewhere in the system, upstream, downstream, or in specific industries, how does this affect production? Now, here's one graph, and I'm going to come back to the source of this graph later on, that gives you a flavor of how to think about this issue broadly speaking, not specifically in this paper. This is the supply chain for cars, for the car industries. And what you have down here on the horizontal axis is the standard deviation, so some measure of volatility of the growth of value added of different parts of the supply chain. And here you have a measure of upstreamness. So what you can see here for the car industry, some of the upstream stages, copper, nickel, oil and gas extraction, they tend to be more volatile. And the more downstream elements of production down here, paints or fabricated metals, hardware, and so on, tend to be less downstream. So this is one example of how volatility is related to supply chains, but that's just to sort of set the scene. In this paper, one way to think about a mechanism, how this can work, is sort of here roughly as a toy model on one slide. So think about you have a standard production function, say Cobb-Douglas, up here with capital and some other input M. And imagine that input is supplied in a stochastic way. That's the second equation up here. And there's a volatility attached to it. It's time-varying volatility is sigma. And now suppose that's actually stochastic in itself. So you can think of that as a second moment supply chain shock. That's the setting that we're facing here. And then if you add a few steps, if you make profits concave in M, then you're going to get, because of the inequality, that, well, when the variance rises, production tends to be depressed, and you're going to get input substitution towards more reliable supplies. I'm not saying this is sort of the key mechanism in this paper, but this is one way of thinking about this. And I'm not doing justice to the paper here, because the paper is actually all about this M. And most of the action in the paper is actually on M, because M is a composite of lots and lots of other things in the supply chain. And this is where the authors deserve a lot of credit. So the way I see this, I have to say also that I just had slides, which sometimes were not so easy to follow, because it's very, very hard and very complex. But it's a really fantastic paper, and I see the main contribution as doing all of this in GE with second moment shocks that vary at the level of I, J, S. So I and J are the buyer and seller, and S is the stage of production. So, and then one of the outcomes you get is you have an expression, analytical expression, for the sourcing shares as a function of this volatility, and of course if the volatility changes, then the sourcing changes. So that's a really fantastic toolbox to have, and the authors deserve a lot of credit for that. And then of course you can play with that. You can feed in upstream shocks, downstream shocks, you can shock entire countries. Historically, lots of examples you can think about where this might matter. So one that came to mind is the commodity lottery. So here's a paper by Blattman et al., and that goes back a lot further. Say the history of Argentina is a big topic in that context. So I think these are all issues that we can think about through the framework here that the authors put forward. What I would say is maybe you can have a toy version, or it's just for starters, a bit less math, more intuition. I think would be very helpful for most readers, but that would be very easy for you to do. In terms of my substantive comments, one concern here is first moment versus second moment shocks. So you find that the sourcing shares, they decrease in the risky stage. The intuition here tends to be quite similar to a standard gravity intuition, although the nuances are quite different. But how does it qualitatively really matter? I think you can answer those questions in the paper straightforwardly. but it wasn't quite clear to me yet. And then on the quantitative side, how can we distinguish them? That's also, of course, the well-known empirical challenge that these first moment and second moment shocks tend to be correlated. So somewhat different perspective, but clearly related, is the paper by Paul and Alonso, Paul sitting right there, who think about downstream production as well and centrality of periphery. And one of the key results in that paper is that it tends to be optimal to locate relatively downstream stages of production in relatively central locations. So you think about this as sort of a second moment approach to that, which I think is a great addition. You do have more flexible substitution patterns, but I think you can kind of point out a little bit more what exactly that bias is. I mean, you kind of touched upon that in the introduction. But relating to that kind of literature and pointing out precisely where the differences lie, I think would be helpful. Here's another flavor of that literature. Alessandro Ferrari has a great paper on demand shock amplification at the end. So you have the downstream shock, and he stresses the role of inventories quite a lot. So if I hope I don't misunderstand this. So sometimes input orders may go unfulfilled in your framework. And then the question is, why don't firms build up inventory? So that's sort of a classic mechanism that people are focused on. And you could also relate to that. And the picture that I had at the beginning on the car industry is actually from this paper by Lang, Luren, and Savinsky, who also focus on demand shock amplifications of a bullwhip paper. And this one is a truly dynamic time to build type of model. Which leads me to my next point. What is very interesting in this environment of risk and uncertainty is static versus dynamic efficiency, and I think that would be very interesting to talk more about. It's a bit hard for you to do this. You do have sequential production, but it's essentially a static model, so you can't really speak to that. But I think that's, especially from a policy point of view, quite interesting to look into, and maybe you can actually go down that route. But asking you to make it fully dynamic is maybe a bit asking too much. And finally, some conceptual issues that probably matter for policy, and actually you touched upon some of them. So one of them is critical inputs that came up in the previous presentation, or Hélène talked about this. So what if you have like rare earths that are really hard to substitute? I think that's something you can actually and do talk about in that paper. That would be very interesting to explore a little bit further. And then what about scale economies? Then you can get in this trade-off between low cost or cheap convenience because something is very easy to do, like the SWIFT system, versus you perceive it as very risky or potentially volatile. So that trade-off, I think, is also really an interesting one to look at. You may not be able to do this in the framework, though, so maybe I'm asking for a bit too much. Shock propagation at the firm level, ultimately, so there's, of course, the Nick Bloom literature, there's the Japan paper, there's the Balbomani Pakistan, the flooding paper, who look at similar questions. It's not exactly the same, but at the firm level. So thinking about this, how can we attack this with firm level data would be interesting. And one final point, and then I will end, which I didn't put on the slides, is actually this question of imbalances. So it's general equilibrium, so you can look at that. So if you have a shock somewhere in the system, upstream, downstream, or in some specific country, it's a second moment shock. How does it affect at least bilateral imbalances? That's probably a question that you could ask straight away with your framework. So fantastic paper, really difficult issue that you cracked here, so well done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I guess we can again collect a few questions because we are running a bit out of time. Is there any questions from the audience? Okay, so I guess you can reply.
I'm just going to thank Dennis because honestly, I am amazed that you came up with that with the slides I sent you. So I really appreciate it. It's super, super valuable feedback. I think dynamics are going to push it a little bit for us. We can try, but I'm not sure we will dynamics in GE. But I fully empathize with that point. Inventories, again, I think this is a very important mechanism. Huama and Gaurav and I have some previous work where we actually do have firm level data where we could assess whether firms are diversifying or holding inventories, and we found that they were diversifying a lot more than holding inventories. So at least in that firm level data, diversification seemed to be much more of a more salient mechanism, and so that's why we're pushing that. But of course, in the real world, both of these will exist, and so we could think about some trade-off between them, but we don't have that right now. Other than that, many of these things, like critical inputs, we can actually have these sectors. We just have to lower the substitution elasticity within the sector, to make it. So we can do these things, and that's why we're excited about this model, because it allows us to think about many of these questions. But again, it's very much work in progress. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much then. I think we can, unless there is a last question. Okay, so I guess we can close the session. Thanks again for the participation. We now move towards lunch, so I guess everybody's